Welcome, fellow traveler of infinite realities, to the complete chronicle of Rick Sanchez and the multiverse that shaped him into both genius and monster. Tonight, we explore the tragic transformation of a brilliant inventor whose love for his family became the seed of cosmic destruction. Settle comfortably as we journey through dimensions of loss, revenge, and the terrible price of unlimited power. Let this story of interdimensional chaos and family dysfunction carry you toward peaceful rest, knowing that unlike Rick, your existence remains beautifully finite and meaningful in ways that infinite possibilities can never replicate. The man who would become the most dangerous being across infinite realities was not born into his legendary status, but discovered his extraordinary capabilities. Gradually, like uncovering hidden rooms in a house he thought he understood completely. In the early decades of his life, before portal technology existed, even as theoretical possibility, before the multiverse became his playground and his prison, Rick Sanchez was simply a brilliant young man with an insatiable curiosity about the fundamental mechanisms that governed existence and an almost compulsive need to understand everything that captured his attention through direct investigation and experimentation. His childhood had been unremarkable by most conventional standards, unfolding in the comfortable predictability of mid-20th century suburban America, where scientific curiosity was encouraged but rarely nurtured with the intensity that Rick's exceptional mind demanded. His parents were decent, hard-working people who recognized their son's unusual intelligence but lacked the educational background or resources to provide the kind of advanced scientific training that might have channeled his gifts toward more constructive purposes. They encouraged his academic achievements while worrying privately about his tendency toward obsessive focus and his apparent difficulty forming the kind of casual friendships that seemed to come naturally to other children his age. The signs of Rick's extraordinary intellectual capacity were apparent to anyone who bothered to observe him carefully during those formative years. He would disassemble household appliances with the methodical precision of a trained engineer, studying the intricate relationships between components until he understood not merely how they functioned, but why they had been designed according to particular principles, rather than alternative approaches that might have achieved similar results through different methods. His bedroom became a workshop filled with half-completed projects that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mechanical and electrical principles that most adults never mastered, while his notebooks contained theoretical investigations into questions that wouldn't be addressed by mainstream science for decades. School provided Rick with access to formal scientific education, but also revealed the vast intellectual gulf that separated him from his peers and even from most of his teachers, who found themselves challenged by questions that exceeded their own training and expertise. He absorbed mathematical concepts with intuitive understanding that amazed his instructors, grasped scientific principles through leaps of insight that suggested natural facility for theoretical work, and demonstrated practical engineering capabilities that indicated potential for significant contributions to technological development. But this intellectual superiority came at considerable social cost, creating barriers between Rick and other students that would persist throughout his educational career and contribute to the isolation that would later make his personal losses so psychologically devastating. The loneliness that accompanied Rick's intellectual giftedness drove him deeper into independent research and experimentation, creating patterns of behavior that would characterize his approach to problem-solving throughout his life. He spent countless hours in makeshift laboratories he constructed in his family's basement and garage, pursuing investigations that ranged from simple electronic devices to increasingly sophisticated attempts at understanding the mathematical principles that governed physical reality. at its most fundamental levels. These early experiments lacked the advanced materials and theoretical frameworks that would later enable him to crack the secrets of interdimensional travel, but they established the methodical approach and fearless curiosity that would define his entire scientific career. The reputation for brilliance that Rick developed during his teenage years attracted attention from universities and research institutions, eager to recruit exceptional talent for their most ambitious projects. But Rick found himself increasingly uninterested in working within established academic structures that seemed designed to constrain rather than encourage the kind of revolutionary thinking that his investigations suggested might be possible. The bureaucratic limitations and collaborative requirements of institutional research conflicted with his preference for complete intellectual autonomy and his growing conviction that most of his contemporaries lacked the vision necessary to appreciate the true significance of the work he was pursuing. By the time Rick reached his early 20s, his decision to pursue independent research from his own laboratory represented both practical necessity and philosophical choice about how scientific discovery should be conducted. The garage that would later become the site of his most important breakthroughs started as simply a workspace where Rick could investigate questions that interested him without interference from supervisors who might not understand the long-term implications of his theoretical work. The controlled chaos of half-finished inventions, mathematical equations covering every available surface, and improvised equipment that somehow produced results exceeding what professionally designed instruments could achieve, became the external manifestation of Rick's internal creative process. During these years of independent investigation, Rick's personal life maintained a precarious balance between his scientific obsessions and his growing relationship with Diane, a remarkable woman whose intelligence and emotional maturity proved capable of penetrating the psychological barriers that Rick's intellectual gifts had created around his capacity for normal human connection. Diane understood intuitively that Rick's dedication to his research was not rejection of social relationships, but rather his way of trying to comprehend and potentially improve the world for those he cared about most deeply. Her acceptance of his eccentricities and her genuine interest in his discoveries provided Rick with the emotional stability he needed to pursue increasingly ambitious theoretical work while maintaining the human connections that kept his research grounded in practical considerations about real-world applications. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of Rick's developing reputation as a brilliant but unconventional scientist whose theoretical work was beginning to suggest possibilities that mainstream academic institutions were not prepared to acknowledge or investigate seriously. Diane proved to be more than just a supportive romantic partner during this crucial period of Rick's development, becoming his most trusted intellectual collaborator and offering insights that helped him approach complex problems from perspectives he might not have considered independently. Her presence in his life represented the first time Rick had found someone whose company he valued as much as solitude, whose opinions he respected as much as his own analytical capabilities. The decision to marry represented a fundamental shift in Rick's priorities and self-understanding, requiring him to acknowledge that human relationships could provide forms of satisfaction and meaning that scientific achievement alone could never supply. The wedding ceremony was intimate and unpretentious, reflecting both Rick and Diane's preference for substance over social spectacle, but the commitment they made to each other was profound and transformative. The marriage established the foundation for a partnership that would produce not only personal happiness, but also some of Rick's most creative and significant work during the period when he still believed that scientific progress could make the world a genuinely better place for everyone. The birth of Beth marked another dramatic transformation in Rick's understanding of what mattered most in existence, introducing him to forms of love and protective responsibility that his scientific training had not prepared him to analyze or categorize adequately. holding his daughter for the first time. Seeing her tiny fingers instinctively wrap around his thumb with unconscious trust, Rick experienced emotions that were simultaneously irrational and absolutely compelling, adding dimensions to his existence that made every equation more meaningful because it was part of the world he was helping to create for her future happiness and security. Fatherhood revealed aspects of Rick's personality that had remained dormant during his years of focused academic and professional development, demonstrating reserves of patience and gentleness that surprised everyone who knew him primarily as a brilliant but intense scientist. He took genuine pleasure in explaining complex scientific concepts in terms that an intelligent child could understand, transforming his garage laboratory into a place where father and daughter could work together on projects that were simultaneously educational and entertaining. Their shared construction of elaborate mechanical toys and simple but functional inventions created bonds between them that were based on mutual curiosity and respect rather than simple parental authority. The family routines that developed around Rick's research schedule represented a carefully negotiated balance between his scientific pursuits and his domestic responsibilities, demonstrating his commitment to being present for the people he loved, while still pursuing the theoretical work that his genius demanded. Mornings belonged to family time, with breakfast conversations and planning for the day's activities that grounded Rick in immediate practical concerns about his wife and daughter's welfare and happiness. Afternoons were reserved for research, providing Rick with the intellectual stimulation and creative challenges his mind required for psychological health and continued development of his revolutionary theories about the nature of reality. Evenings brought the family together for dinner, and the quiet companionship that characterized healthy family relationships. But these domestic interludes also provided Rick with opportunities to process and integrate the insights his research was generating about the fundamental structure of existence. The balance between scientific work and family life was sustainable because both aspects of his existence seemed to reinforce and enrich each other, with his love for Diane and Beth providing emotional motivation for research that might benefit humanity, while his scientific achievements provided practical improvements to their daily lives and financial security for their future. The theoretical work Rick pursued during this period of domestic stability built systematically toward the mathematical insights that would eventually enable him to understand and manipulate the fundamental forces governing interdimensional travel, but his research retained an ethical framework and humanitarian purpose that reflected his connection to family and community. His notebooks from these years reveal investigations into energy manipulation, quantum mechanics, and consciousness studies that were motivated by genuine desire to reduce human suffering and expand the possibilities for meaningful existence, rather than by simple intellectual curiosity or desire for personal power and recognition. The scientific breakthroughs Rick achieved during his marriage represented the culmination of years of independent research combined with the emotional stability and intellectual collaboration that his relationship with Diane provided. But perhaps more importantly, they reflected his continued belief that knowledge should serve human welfare rather than simply satisfy academic curiosity. The theories he developed about parallel universes and dimensional physics were mathematically elegant and intellectually satisfying, but they were also grounded in practical considerations about how such discoveries might be applied to solve real problems and improve conditions for ordinary people. But even during these happy and productive years, Rick's research was beginning to reveal possibilities that challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of reality and the limitations that constrained human existence, suggesting that the universe might be far stranger and more malleable than anyone had previously imagined. The mathematical relationships he was discovering implied that infinite alternate versions of reality might exist simultaneously. that consciousness might be transferable between different versions of the same person, and that sufficiently advanced technology might enable travel between dimensions that operated according to entirely different physical laws and social structures. The implications of these theoretical possibilities were simultaneously exhilarating and disturbing, suggesting that everything Rick understood about identity, meaning, and moral responsibility might be based on assumptions that could not survive contact with the full complexity of multiversal existence. But during this period of family happiness, these philosophical complications remained abstract intellectual challenges rather than immediate practical concerns, allowing Rick to pursue his investigations while maintaining his emotional investment in the particular reality where he lived with the people he loved most in any possible universe. The garage workshop where Rick conducted his experiments became a sanctuary that embodied the perfect balance between scientific ambition and human connection, filled with evidence of both his intellectual achievements and his emotional investments. Beth's artwork decorated the walls alongside his theoretical calculations. Diane's organizational improvements made his work more efficient and productive, and the countless small modifications they had made together transformed a simple workspace into the heart of a home where science served love rather than replacing it with abstract intellectual pursuits. The man Rick was during this final period, before tragedy destroyed his world, represented perhaps the best possible outcome for someone born with his extraordinary capabilities, demonstrating that genius could coexist with humility, that power could be tempered by responsibility, and that scientific achievement could enhance rather than diminish capacity for meaningful human relationships. The Rick Sanchez, who lived in those last peaceful months, was exactly the kind of person the universe needed more of. Someone whose intelligence was guided by wisdom, whose capabilities were constrained by conscience, and whose understanding of infinite possibilities was balanced by appreciation for the beautiful limitations that made individual lives precious and irreplaceable. But this ideal balance between cosmic understanding and human connection was about to be shattered by the arrival of a visitor who would offer Rick everything he thought he wanted, while destroying everything he actually needed, transforming him from the man the universe needed into the monster it would spend decades trying to contain and ultimately failing to destroy. The happiness that characterized this period would soon become a memory so painful that Rick would spend the rest of his existence trying to replace it with relationships that could never quite fill the void created by the loss of the only people who had ever loved him when love was simple and unconditional and based on who he was rather than what he could do. The moment that would forever divide Rick Sanchez's existence into before and after arrived on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon when he was alone in his garage workshop, absorbed in calculations that explored the theoretical possibility of consciousness transfer between parallel versions of the same individual across different dimensional frameworks. The mathematics were elegant but purely hypothetical, representing intellectual curiosity rather than practical application. When the air in front of his workbench began to shimmer and distort in ways that violated every principle of physics Rick understood, creating a breach in the fabric of space-time that materialized into a swirling portal of impossible geometric complexity. The figure who stepped through this dimensional gateway was immediately recognizable as another version of Rick himself, but one whose bearing and expression suggested experiences and capabilities that far exceeded anything Rick had achieved in his own reality. This alternate Rick moved with casual confidence that spoke of absolute mastery over forces that Rick's dimension had not yet discovered, carrying technologies that seemed to bend the fundamental laws of nature to his will, while treating such miraculous capabilities as routine aspects of daily existence. His presence in the garage radiated power and knowledge that made Rick's own considerable achievements seem primitive and limited by comparison. The conversation that followed would haunt Rick for the remainder of his existence, not because of its duration or complexity, but because of the choice it forced him to make between the life he had built and the possibilities it offered for transcending every limitation he had ever encountered. Rick Prime, as this visitor would later be known, explained with casual certainty that infinite versions of reality existed simultaneously, that travel between these dimensions was not only possible, but commonplace among Ricks who had accepted the truth about the nature of existence, and that Rick's attachment to his particular family was an arbitrary constraint that prevented him from achieving his full potential. The portal technology that Rick Prime demonstrated was beyond anything Rick had imagined possible, enabling instantaneous travel between realities that operated according to entirely different physical laws and contained infinite variations on every conceivable theme of existence. The mathematical principles underlying interdimensional travel were presented not as theoretical constructs, but as practical tools that could transform Rick from a brilliant scientist trapped in a single reality into a godlike being, capable of experiencing everything the multiverse had to offer. The offer was presented as inevitable evolution rather than choice, the natural progression for any Rick whose intelligence had developed sufficiently to recognize the arbitrary nature of dimensional boundaries. But Rick Prime's most disturbing revelation was not the existence of infinite realities, but rather the casual dismissal of individual relationships and attachments as temporary inconveniences that enlightened beings learn to transcend through exposure to unlimited alternatives. The love Rick felt for Diane and Beth was characterized as provincial sentiment that would seem laughably naive once he experienced the infinite variations of family relationships available across dimensional boundaries. Every person Rick cherished in his current reality had countless alternate versions, living different lives and making different choices, rendering attachment to any particular version arbitrary and ultimately meaningless. The philosophical implications of Rick Prime's worldview were as seductive as they were horrifying, suggesting that moral responsibility became irrelevant when every possible outcome occurred somewhere across infinite dimensions, that individual choices lost significance when every alternative was simultaneously being explored by alternate versions of the same person, and that emotional attachments represented psychological limitations that prevented access to experiences and capabilities that transcended normal human understanding. The multiverse Rick Prime described was a place where genius could operate without constraint, where every desire could be fulfilled, and where the petty concerns of ordinary existence could be abandoned in favor of cosmic-scale adventures and achievements. Rick's response to this offer revealed the fundamental moral character that would make his subsequent transformation so tragic and psychologically devastating. Despite the obvious intellectual appeal of unlimited knowledge and the practical attractions of godlike power, Rick recognized instinctively that accepting Rick Prime's invitation would require him to abandon everything that made his existence meaningful and worthwhile. His love for Diane and Beth was not arbitrary attachment, but rather the foundation of his identity and the source of his motivation for scientific achievement that served purposes beyond simple, intellectual satisfaction. The refusal Rick delivered was quiet, but absolute, explaining that he had already found everything he needed in his current reality and saw no reason to sacrifice relationships that provided genuine happiness for abstract possibilities that might offer power, but would certainly require abandoning the people who made that power worth having. His work as a scientist was motivated by desire to improve the world for his family, rather than by need to demonstrate his intellectual superiority, and his achievements were meaningful precisely because they served people he loved rather than simply satisfying his curiosity about the nature of existence. Rick Prime's reaction to this rejection revealed the casual cruelty and fundamental emptiness that characterized his approach to existence across infinite realities, demonstrating that his offer of partnership had been motivated not by genuine respect for Rick's capabilities, but by need to validate his own choices through converting others to his nihilistic worldview. The anger that flickered across his face was not disappointment at losing a potential ally, but rage at encountering a version of himself who had found forms of meaning and satisfaction that Rick Prime had sacrificed in pursuit of power, freedom that had ultimately proven hollow and unsatisfying. The bomb that Rick Prime produced from his dimensional storage device was not a weapon of war but an instrument of philosophical terrorism, designed not merely to kill Rick's family, but to demonstrate the futility of choosing love over power and the inevitable consequences of refusing to embrace the meaninglessness that Rick Prime had accepted as the fundamental truth of multiversal existence. The device was elegant in its simplicity and absolute in its destructive capability, representing technology so advanced that no defense Rick could conceive would prove adequate to protect the people he loved from its effects. The moments between Rick Prime's departure and the explosion that would destroy everything Rick valued passed with dreamlike slowness, allowing him to experience with perfect clarity the last seconds of the life he had chosen to defend through his refusal to abandon his family for infinite possibilities. Diane was in the kitchen preparing dinner while humming softly to herself, completely unaware that her existence was about to be terminated by forces she could never have imagined. Beth was in her room working on homework assignments that would never be completed, making plans for a future that would never arrive, trusting in the safety and security that her father's love had always provided. Rick's desperate attempt to reach his family before the bomb detonated was motivated not by any realistic hope of saving them, but by need to be with them during their final moments, to ensure that his last act in their shared reality was an expression of love rather than the scientific work that had occupied him when their killer arrived. The mathematical equations that had seemed so important minutes earlier were now revealed as meaningless abstractions compared to the simple human desire to hold the people he cherished while they faced annihilation together. But the distance between his garage and the house might as well have been infinite, given the seconds remaining before the explosion. The blast that vaporized Diane and Beth was engineered with scientific precision to ensure maximum psychological impact on the survivor, eliminating Rick's family completely, while leaving him physically unharmed to experience the full emotional devastation of their loss. The energy release was contained and directed in ways that preserved the physical structure of Rick's reality, while destroying its emotional and psychological foundations, creating a world where everything reminded him of what he had lost, while providing no possibility of recovery or replacement through normal human processes. The silence that followed the explosion was not peaceful absence of sound, but rather the horrible quiet that accompanies the sudden termination of all the small noises that make a house feel alive and inhabited. There were no more footsteps in the hallway, no more conversations drifting from the kitchen, no more laughter or arguments, or the 1,000 tiny sounds that had provided the soundtrack to Rick's domestic happiness. The world continued to exist in all its physical particulars while becoming fundamentally empty of everything that had given Rick's existence meaning and purpose. Rick's initial response to the catastrophe was psychological paralysis rather than dramatic grief, as his brilliant mind struggled to process the sudden transition from perfect happiness to absolute loss without any intermediate stages that might have prepared him for such devastation. The scientific training that had taught him to analyze complex problems through systematic investigation proved utterly inadequate for comprehending the emotional reality of permanent separation from the people who had defined his problems through systematic investigation, understanding of love, purpose, and identity. The man who could manipulate fundamental forces of nature found himself helpless in the face of simple human mortality. The hours and days that followed the bombing passed in a haze of dissociation and denial, as Rick attempted to function normally in a reality that had been stripped of everything that made normal functioning possible or meaningful. He found himself preparing breakfast for 3 people instead of 1, setting the table with place settings for family members who would never again join him for meals, conducting conversations with people who existed only in his memory and increasingly desperate imagination. The house that had been filled with love and laughter became a museum of loss where every object carried unbearable associations with happiness that could never be recovered. The garage workshop where Rick had been working when the bomb arrived became both sanctuary and torture chamber, the only space where he could escape reminders of his family's presence while simultaneously confronting the scientific equipment and theoretical investigations that had occupied him during their final moments. The equations covering his workbenches now seemed like evidence of misplaced priorities, time and attention that should have been devoted to his wife and daughter instead of abstract mathematical relationships that had contributed nothing to protecting them from the violence that had destroyed them. But it was in this garage, surrounded by the tools and materials of his scientific career, that Rick began the gradual psychological transformation from grieving survivor into instrument of revenge, as his analytical mind turned its full attention toward understanding the technology that had killed his family and developing capabilities that would enable him to track down their murderer across infinite realities. The bomb that Rick Prime had used was sophisticated beyond anything that contemporary science could produce, incorporating principles of energy, manipulation, and dimensional physics that suggested knowledge of multiversal mechanics far more advanced than anything Rick had achieved. The decision to pursue portal technology was not made through dramatic revelation or sudden inspiration, but rather through slow recognition that revenge represented the only goal that seemed worth achieving given the emptiness that now characterized his existence. The love that had motivated his previous scientific work had been transformed into hatred that was equally powerful, but far more destructive in its applications and implications. The same intellectual capabilities that had once been directed toward improving the world for his family were now channeled toward developing weapons that could reach across dimensions to destroy the being who had murdered everything Rick owns. Valued. The theoretical framework necessary for interdimensional travel was already present in Rick's research, requiring only practical application and engineering refinement to transform mathematical abstractions into functional technology. But the development process that had once been motivated by curiosity and humanitarian concern now proceeded with grim mechanical precision, driven by need for capabilities that would enable violence rather than knowledge that would benefit humanity. The garage that had been a place of collaborative discovery became a factory for producing instruments of multiversal warfare. The months Rick spent developing practical portal travel represented the beginning of his transformation from brilliant scientist into something approaching a cosmic force of destruction, as his growing understanding of interdimensional mechanics revealed possibilities for power and violence that exceeded anything he had previously imagined. The ability to travel between realities was just the foundation for capabilities that could reshape the fundamental structure of existence according to his desires for revenge and control. The man who had once refused godlike power to preserve his family relationships now pursued those same capabilities in service of destroying the being who had made such relationships impossible. The first successful portal Rick created was small and unstable, remaining open for only seconds before collapsing back into normal space-time. But it proved that the theoretical principles underlying Rick Prime's technology were sound, and that with sufficient development, Rick could achieve similar mastery over interdimensional forces. The breakthrough was simultaneously the culmination of his greatest scientific achievement and the beginning of his descent into monstrous behavior that would eventually make him indistinguishable from the enemy he sought to destroy across space and infinite realities. The psychological impact of achieving interdimensional travel was as profound as the technical accomplishment itself, as Rick realized that he now possessed capabilities that placed him beyond normal human limitations and moral categories, while also confirming that his family's murderer was somewhere in the infinite expanse of parallel realities, accessible but possibly impossible to locate among countless alternatives. The multiverse that had seemed like abstract theoretical concept was now his hunting ground, but it was also a maze of such complexity that finding Rick Prime might require decades or centuries of systematic searching through realities that contained infinite variations on every theme of existence. But perhaps most disturbing was Rick's growing recognition that the pursuit of revenge was changing him in fundamental ways that would make him unrecognizable to the people he was supposedly avenging, transforming the loving husband and father they had known into something capable of casual violence and systematic murder that would eventually exceed Rick Prime's own crimes in scope and brutality. The man who had once chosen love over power was becoming exactly the kind of being who might casually murder other people's families in pursuit of personal objectives, completing a cycle of corruption that began with Rick Prime's bomb and would end with Rick's transformation into a monster worthy of the hatred he directed toward his family's killer. The first dimension Rick visited after perfecting his portal technology was nearly identical to his own reality in every observable detail, differing only in minor variations that seemed insignificant compared to the overwhelming similarity of landscape, architecture, and most importantly, the Rick Sanchez who inhabited that parallel world. This alternate version of himself was working in a garage workshop that looked exactly like Rick's own laboratory, pursuing research projects that paralleled his own investigations before tragedy had redirected his efforts toward weaponizing interdimensional physics, living the life that Rick recognized as the existence he might have continued if his family had not been murdered by Rick Prime's casual cruelty. The kill was accomplished with clinical efficiency, using a weapon Rick had designed specifically for eliminating alternate versions of himself across multiple realities. But the death provided none of the satisfaction or sense of justice that Rick had anticipated during months of preparation and planning. The other Rick died without understanding what was happening or recognizing the forces that had brought his executioner across dimensional boundaries, seeking revenge against an enemy who wore their shared face. Rick felt no triumph in the murder, no sense that cosmic balance had been restored, only cold recognition that this particular alternate self was not Rick Prime and had therefore died for crimes he had never committed. The absence of satisfaction did not deter Rick from continuing his systematic hunt across increasingly numerous realities, each one containing a Rick who might potentially be the murderer he sought among infinite variations of himself. The pattern established itself with mechanical regularity as Rick developed increasingly efficient methods for locating dimensions containing versions of Rick Sanchez, traveling there through portal technology that grew more sophisticated with each iteration, eliminating targets who shared his face and intellect, but not his specific history of loss and motivation for violence, searching for evidence that might indicate whether each victim had been Rick Prime, and moving on to the next reality when investigations proved fruitless. The psychological transformation that accompanied Rick's campaign of multiversal murder was as dramatic as any technological achievement he had accomplished, gradually converting the grieving widower, who had spent months in catatonic depression, into something harder and more focused, a being whose capacity for normal human emotion had been channeled entirely into pursuit of revenge so pure and concentrated that it began reshaping his fundamental understanding of morality, identity, and the value of individual existence. The love Rick had felt for Diane and Beth did not disappear, but was transformed into fuel for hatred that burned with steady intensity across years of violence that would have been unimaginable to his former self. Each murder taught Rick something new about the practical mechanics of killing and the psychological processes necessary for overcoming moral inhibitions that had been conditioned through decades of civilized existence. But perhaps more importantly, each death revealed additional aspects of his own personality and capabilities that domestic life had never required him to acknowledge or develop. The first few kills had demanded conscious effort to suppress empathy and overcome reluctance to harm beings who resembled him so closely. But repetition gradually eliminated these internal obstacles until Rick could evaluate alternate versions of himself with the detached, analytical approach he might have applied to laboratory specimens. The realities Rick visited during his hunt revealed the vast scope of possible variations in circumstances and outcomes, while simultaneously demonstrating the essential continuity that connected all versions of Rick Sanchez across dimensional boundaries, regardless of the different experiences that had shaped their individual development and choices. Some Ricks were more successful than others in conventional terms, some happier, some more isolated, but all shared fundamental characteristics of intelligence, arrogance, and emotional vulnerability that made them recognizably the same person despite differences in history and environment that ranged from subtle to dramatic in their implications. This recognition of similarity across dimensional variations made Rick's systematic murder campaign psychologically easier rather than more difficult, as he began to perceive his alternate selves not as unique individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and relationships, but as repetitions of basic themes that could be eliminated without meaningful loss to the broader structure of multiversal existence. The deaths accumulated into statistics rather than tragedies, numbers that marked progress toward his ultimate objective rather than termination of conscious beings who had committed no crimes except existing in realities that Rick needed to search in his quest for the specific version of himself who had actually murdered his family. The efficiency of Rick's killing methods improved with experience and technological development, but the fundamental futility of his approach became increasingly apparent as months turned into years without any sign of Rick Prime or evidence that would indicate his location among infinite possible realities. Each dimension Rick eliminated from consideration brought him no closer to his target, while simultaneously adding to the total of violence he had committed in pursuit of justice that seemed increasingly abstract and distant from the immediate grief that had originally motivated his transformation into multiversal predator. The accumulation of murders began to attract attention from other Ricks who had developed their own portal technology and were monitoring interdimensional activity for threats to their security and ongoing research projects, creating the first systematic opposition Rick had encountered since beginning his campaign of revenge across parallel realities. The disappearance of Ricks from numerous dimensions created patterns that scientifically minded versions of himself could detect and analyze using methods similar to those Rick employed in his own investigations, leading to attempts at tracking down the source of these eliminations before they could spread to additional realities. Some of the Ricks who became aware of the systematic killing campaign attempted to organize defensive measures based on shared recognition that their intellectual similarity made cooperation more practical than individual resistance, while others tried to track down Rick Cone 37 directly using analytical techniques and technological resources that exceeded what any single Rick could deploy independently. But Rick's advantages in experience and motivation, combined with his head start in both portal technology and practical knowledge of multiversal navigation, made him nearly impossible for isolated individuals to locate or challenge effectively through conventional methods. The encounter with the secret meeting of Ricks who had gathered to coordinate their response to the threat Rick posed marked a crucial escalation in his campaign from targeted assassination to open warfare against versions of himself who had committed no greater crime than existing in realities he needed to search. The assembly had been organized in a dimension chosen specifically for its isolation and defensibility, with representatives from dozens of realities attempting to develop strategies that might enable them to survive contact with what they correctly perceived as an existential threat to Rick Sanchez across infinite dimensions. Rick's infiltration of their gathering was accomplished through technological superiority and strategic thinking that demonstrated how completely his focus had narrowed to elimination of obstacles that prevented him from continuing his search for Rick Prime, regardless of whether those obstacles represented legitimate self-defense or simply inconvenient resistance to his activities. The bomb he planted in their meeting place was designed not for precision targeting, but for maximum casualties among beings who shared his intellectual capabilities, while lacking his specific motivation for violence and his accumulated experience with interdimensional warfare. The explosion that simultaneously eliminated dozens of Ricks was Rick's most efficient single act of violence since beginning his hunt, but it also represented his final transition from grief-motivated individual seeking specific revenge to something approaching a cosmic force that threatened the existence of Rick Sanchez across multiple realities regardless of their individual culpability or involvement in his family's murder. The survivors who escaped the bombing carried word of Rick Cone 37's capabilities and ruthlessness to other dimensions, creating a reputation that would precede him into subsequent realities and fundamentally alter the nature of his continued campaign. The fear that other Ricks began displaying when confronted by Rick Cone 37 served as validation of his success in becoming the apex predator in a multiverse populated by versions of himself, while also highlighting how completely he had diverged from the man he had been before Diane and Beth's deaths transformed him into an instrument of systematic violence. The Rick who had once taken pleasure in collaborative scientific discussion with intellectual equals now inspired terror in alternate versions of himself who recognized him as something that had evolved beyond normal categories of morality or restraint. But the most psychologically damaging aspect of Rick's multiversal killing spree was not the violence itself, but his growing recognition that each victim represented a version of himself who had made different choices about how to version of him respond to trauma, loss, and the discovery of infinite realities beyond his original dimension. Every murder eliminated not just a potential Rick Prime, but also a possibility for what Rick Cone 37 might have become if he had chosen healing over revenge, cooperation over isolation, or acceptance over the compulsive need to impose his will on existence through superior firepower and technological dominance. The formation of what would eventually become the Citadel of Ricks represented both a tactical challenge to Rick's continued hunting activities and a philosophical crisis that forced him to confront questions about his place in the Ron Munnis, broader community of beings who shared his essential nature and capabilities. The alliance of Ricks, who had organized for mutual protection against his campaign of elimination, possessed collective knowledge and resources that exceeded what any individual Rick could accumulate. But their cooperation also demonstrated forms of social organization that Rick had rejected when he chose solitary pursuit of revenge over collaborative approaches to addressing shared threats and challenges. Rick's response to the formation of organized Rick society was characteristically uncompromising, treating their attempts at peaceful coexistence and mutual aid as obstacles to his mission that needed to be overcome through superior violence, rather than forms of community that might offer alternatives to his isolation and single-minded focus on destruction. The philosophical frameworks that enabled Rick cooperation seemed like weakness to someone whose grief had been transformed into strength through complete abandonment of normal human attachments and moral constraints that might interfere with practical necessities of multiversal warfare. The invitation to join Rick's civilization was extended with genuine hope that Rick Cone 37 might recognize the benefits of cooperation and shared resources in addressing the challenges that faced all Ricks across infinite realities. But the offer was also motivated by practical recognition that his capabilities made him too dangerous to remain as an external threat to their collective security. The Citadel represented an attempt to contain Rick's violence within institutional frameworks that might channel his abilities toward constructive purposes while providing him with community among beings who could understand and appreciate his intellectual achievements. Rick's rejection of their overtures was delivered with contempt that reflected his fundamental inability to value any goal except his continued hunt for Rick Prime, demonstrating how completely his personality had been reorganized around the single objective that provided structure and meaning to an existence otherwise emptied of everything that had once made life worthwhile. The community that other Ricks had created through cooperation seemed like betrayal of the mission that had consumed his identity, diluting focus that should remain concentrated on the enemy who had murdered his family and escaped justice through interdimensional flight. The years Rick spent as a solitary predator hunting Rick Prime across infinite realities gradually transformed him from damaged human being, seeking justified revenge, into something that transcended normal moral categories and psychological frameworks, becoming a force of nature that threatened the stability of multiversal civilization itself. The intellectual capabilities that had once been directed toward improving life for his family were now focused entirely on developing increasingly sophisticated methods for tracking and eliminating versions of himself who might be Rick Prime, or who simply represented obstacles to his continued search across dimensions that seemed to expand faster than he could investigate them systematically. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Rick's transformation was his growing resemblance to Rick Prime himself, as years of casual violence and systematic disregard for the welfare of beings who resembled him gradually eliminated the moral differences that had originally motivated his refusal to accept portal technology and abandon his family for multiversal adventures. The man who had rejected Rick Prime's offer because he valued love over power had become someone capable of destroying other people's families without hesitation if they interfered with his personal objectives. The Rick who finally paused in his campaign of multiversal murder to take inventory of his achievements and losses was no longer recognizably the same person who had once been motivated by love for Diane and Beth, yet he retained enough memory of his former self to understand exactly what he had sacrificed and what he had become during decades of violence that had failed to bring him any closer to finding the enemy he sought. The brilliant scientist who had believed knowledge could improve the world had learned instead that unlimited power inevitably corrupted even the most justified motivations, transforming victims into perpetrators and ensuring that cycles of violence continued across realities without meaningful resolution or hope for redemption. The multiverse that had once seemed like abstract theoretical concept was now Rick's hunting ground and prison simultaneously, containing infinite possibilities for finding Rick Prime, but also infinite opportunities for becoming lost in violence that served no purpose except avoiding the psychological necessity of confronting grief that could not be resolved through any amount of revenge or destruction. The man who had once chosen finite happiness with his family over infinite power and knowledge had discovered that infinite power without meaningful connections was its own form of imprisonment, trapping him in cycles of violence that provided neither satisfaction nor genuine progress toward his stated objectives. As Rick contemplated the years of murder and the prospect of centuries more searching through realities that might never yield the specific version of himself he sought, he was forced to acknowledge that his hunt for Rick Prime had succeeded in transforming him into exactly the kind of being who might casually murder innocent families in pursuit of personal goals, completing his evolution from victim to monster while bringing him no closer to the justice he claimed to seek across infinite dimensions, filled with versions of himself who had made different choices about love, power, and the meaning of existence in a universe that seemed designed to reward cruelty while punishing compassion and hope. The dimensional coordinates that finally led Rick to Rick Prime's original reality were discovered not through systematic investigation, but through the kind of random quantum fluctuation that infinite realities make statistically inevitable. As Rick's portal gun sensors detected the unique dimensional signature that matched the murderer, he had been hunting across countless parallel worlds for decades of systematic violence and increasingly desperate searching. The readings were unmistakable despite their unexpected appearance during what had begun as routine reconnaissance of a dimensional cluster that showed promising anomalies in its quantum resonance patterns, confirming that this was indeed the home reality of the Rick who had destroyed his family and initiated the cycle of multiversal violence that had consumed Rick's existence. Standing at the spatial coordinates that corresponded to his own home address in this alternate dimension, Rick found himself experiencing emotions he had believed permanently buried beneath years of calculated murder and systematic elimination of obstacles to his revenge mission. The house that materialized through his portal was architecturally identical to the one where he had lived with Diane and Beth, down to microscopic details like paint weathering patterns and the specific arrangement of decorative elements that his wife had chosen, but the overwhelming similarity masked differences that would prove more profound and psychologically significant than anything visible from his initial observation point. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong with this dimension's version of his family structure came from extended surveillance that revealed the complete absence of normal domestic rhythms and activities that should have characterized a household containing the people Rick had lost to Rick Prime's bomb years earlier. The windows remained dark well past the times when Diane should have been visible, preparing breakfast or tending to the small garden where she had grown flowers that Beth had delighted in helping her cultivate, while the driveway showed no evidence of recent vehicle usage, and the mailbox overflowed with accumulated correspondence that suggested prolonged abandonment rather than temporary absence for vacation or family emergency. Rick's decision to approach the house directly rather than continuing his distant observation was motivated by growing certainty that Rick Prime was not present in this dimension and had not been for considerable time, that he had abandoned his original family with the same casual indifference he had demonstrated when murdering Rick Cohn, 37's wife and daughter. The portal device that Rick discovered in the garage confirmed his suspicions about Rick Prime's departure, as sophisticated interdimensional technology sat unused and covered with dust that indicated months or years of neglect by its creator, who had departed for unknown destinations without maintaining connections to his point of origin. The confrontation with this dimension's version of Beth represented Rick's first direct interaction with anyone resembling his murdered daughter since the explosion that had transformed him from loving father into multiversal predator seeking revenge across infinite realities. This Beth was chronologically older than his own daughter had ever lived to become, a fully grown woman with her own marriage, children, and accumulated experiences of disappointment and abandonment that had shaped her into someone both familiar and foreign to Rick's memories of the child he had lost. But her face still carried the same intelligent curiosity that Rick remembered from countless afternoons spent working together in his garage laboratory, the same quick smile that had once provided daily validation of his choices about how to balance scientific achievement with family responsibility. The adult Beth, who answered Rick's knock, was initially suspicious of the stranger claiming to be her absent father, but her wariness was based on practical caution, developed through experience rather than inability to recognize him physically or intellectually. Rick Prime's pattern of periodic appearances, followed by extended disappearances, had taught Beth to be skeptical of anyone who arrived claiming parental authority after prolonged absence, creating defensive psychological mechanisms that treated such claims as potential sources of renewed disappointment, rather than opportunities for genuine reunion. Her first words to Rick expressed not joy at his apparent return, but pointed questions about where he had been and whether he intended to remain present long enough to justify the emotional investment required for rebuilding their relationship. Rick's realization that he was being mistaken for Rick Prime created an opportunity he had not anticipated when beginning his decades-long hunt for his family's murderer, offering him the possibility of assuming the identity and family relationships that Rick Prime had abandoned with characteristic disregard for the welfare of people who depended on him. This dimension's Beth had been betrayed by her original father just as completely as Rick Cone 37 had been devastated by the murder of his wife and daughter, creating symmetrical patterns of loss and abandonment that suggested the possibility for twisted forms of mutual healing through carefully constructed deception. The decision to assume Rick Prime's abandoned identity and family role was made through desperate opportunism rather than careful ethical consideration, bypassing Rick's normal analytical processes through sheer emotional need for connections that might provide meaning and purpose beyond the revenge mission that had consumed his existence without delivering satisfaction or genuine progress towards psychological healing. He had spent decades becoming a monster in pursuit of justice against the Rick who had destroyed his family. But this dimension offered him the chance to reclaim something approximating the domestic relationships he had lost, even if doing so required him to deceive people who deserved honesty about his true origins and motivations. Beth's introduction of Rick to her husband Jerry Smith and their children Summer and Morty revealed the complete family structure that Rick would be joining through his impersonation of their absent patriarch, creating immediate obligations and relationships that his decades of isolation had left him unprepared to navigate successfully. Jerry's obvious discomfort with Rick's sudden reappearance was based not on suspicion about his identity, but on well-founded anxiety about the disruption that Rick's presence would inevitably cause to the emotional stability Jerry had worked to maintain during his father-in-law's absence. Having presumably spent years helping Beth process her feelings about paternal abandonment, Summer's reaction to Rick's arrival demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of family dynamics that adolescents develop when forced to observe adult relationships that affect their security and emotional welfare without providing them meaningful influence over the decisions that shape their daily lives. She was old enough to remember previous occasions when Rick Prime had returned temporarily, creating hope for renewed family connections that were inevitably disappointed when he departed again without explanation or commitment to continued presence. But she was also young enough to want desperately to believe that this time might be different if she could somehow prove herself worthy of sustained paternal attention. But it was Morty's response to Rick's presence that proved most psychologically significant for both the immediate family dynamics and Rick's long-term adjustment to his role as replacement grandfather in a reality that was simultaneously familiar and alien to his previous experience. The 14-year-old boy possessed few clear memories of Rick Prime from earlier visits, having been too young during previous encounters to form lasting impressions of his grandfather's personality, capabilities, or reliability as a family member. This absence of preconceptions made Morty uniquely open to accepting Rick at face value, providing the foundation for relationships that could develop based on immediate interactions rather than historical disappointments. The first weeks of Rick's integration into this alternate version of his family were characterized by constant vigilance and careful performance as he attempted to fulfill his assumed role without revealing the fundamental deception that made his presence possible or accessible to these people who desperately wanted to believe in his genuine care for their welfare. Every conversation required him to navigate between his actual memories and experiences and the personal history that Rick Prime should theoretically have accumulated during his life in this dimension, forcing Rick to construct elaborate fabrications about past events, while suppressing his authentic emotional responses in favor of behaviors that seemed consistent with their expectations. The psychological toll of maintaining this deception was compounded by constant reminders of what Rick had lost when his original family was murdered by the very person whose identity and relationships he was now appropriating for his own emotional survival. Beth's mannerisms were identical to his daughter's, but belonged to a woman whose adult experiences and personality development had occurred without his influence or presence, creating uncanny familiarity combined with profound alienation that made every interaction simultaneously comforting and painful. Jerry's anxieties about family stability echoed concerns that Rick's own Diane might have expressed if she had survived to witness their daughter's marriage, and the challenges of maintaining relationships across generational boundaries. Summer's adolescent struggles with identity and social acceptance resembled developmental challenges that his original Beth might have faced if she had lived to raise children of her own, but these similarities only highlighted the temporal displacement that separated Rick from the natural progression of family life that murder had interrupted. Most disturbing were the moments when Morty's curiosity about scientific principles reminded Rick of his own daughter's childhood questions, creating emotional responses that belonged to his real family history, but had to be channeled into relationships based on deliberate impersonation of someone else's abandoned responsibilities. Rick's initial attempts to fulfill the role of returning grandfather were handicapped by his complete lack of experience with extended family relationships and his tendency to approach emotional situations with the same analytical detachment he had developed during years of systematic violence across multiple realities. His efforts to demonstrate interest in Morty's academic performance resulted in awkward conversations that revealed how little he understood about normal adolescent concerns and social pressures, while his attempts to provide grandfatherly guidance often took the form of technical lectures that confused rather than helped his supposed grandson navigate the complex, emotional, and social challenges of teenage existence. But gradually, Rick began developing genuine emotional investment in Morty's development and welfare that transcended his initial opportunistic motivations for joining this family through deception and identity theft. The boy's obvious intelligence and curiosity about how things worked reminded Rick of his own childhood fascination with mechanical and scientific principles, while Morty's social awkwardness and lack of confidence suggested psychological vulnerabilities that Rick felt uniquely qualified to address through scientific education and technological enhancement of natural capabilities. The adventures that began as simple educational excursions designed to supplement Morty's formal schooling with direct experience of scientific phenomena quickly evolved into interdimensional journeys that Rick's portal technology made possible, transforming ordinary afternoons into explorations of alternate realities and alien civilizations that existed beyond anything Morty could have imagined. But these expeditions also served Rick's psychological need to maintain and demonstrate the advanced technological capabilities that justified his claim to be the brilliant scientist this family remembered, proving his value as protector and mentor, while providing him with intellectual stimulation that domestic routine alone could not supply. The scientific education that Rick provided Morty was motivated by authentic desire to share knowledge and capabilities that might help the boy develop confidence and problem-solving skills. But it was also shaped by Rick's unconscious need to recreate the collaborative relationship he had enjoyed with his original daughter during those precious years before tragedy destroyed everything he valued. The garage workshop where they worked together became a space where Rick could honor his memories of Beth while building new relationships based on genuine affection rather than performed family obligation, even though the foundation of deception remained inescapable. The family's gradual acceptance of Rick's presence created emotional rewards that Rick had not experienced since losing Diane and Beth, providing him with daily validation that his life retained meaning and purpose beyond the revenge mission that had consumed his existence for decades without delivering satisfaction or psychological healing. The simple pleasure of having people who looked forward to his company, who valued his opinions and capabilities, who treated him as essential to their emotional and practical welfare, represented forms of human connection that his years of isolation had taught him to consider permanently lost. But the relationships Rick was building were fundamentally compromised by the deception that made them possible, creating internal contradictions that would eventually prove unsustainable when the truth about his origins and the circumstances of his arrival in their dimension could no longer be hidden or rationalized. Morty's growing attachment to the grandfather he was finally getting to know was based on false assumptions about their relationship and Rick's motivations for investing time and energy in his development, while the adventures they shared created genuine bonds that existed alongside the fundamental lies about Rick's identity and past experiences. The family dynamics that developed during Rick's integration period revealed both his capacity for authentic emotional connection and his inability to engage in relationships that required complete honesty about his motivations, capabilities, and psychological state. The love he began feeling for these replacement family members was real, but was also instrumentalized in ways that treated them as therapeutic tools rather than autonomous individuals deserving of truth about the person they were learning to trust with their emotional and physical welfare. Rick's success in assuming Rick Prime's abandoned family role demonstrated his remarkable adaptability and his desperate need for human connections that could provide meaning beyond systematic violence, but it also revealed the extent to which his years of multiversal hunting had damaged his capacity for the reciprocal vulnerability and mutual respect that healthy family relationships required. The man who had once genuinely loved his original family had become someone capable of simulating love convincingly enough to manipulate people who wanted to believe in his authenticity. But the emotional investment he developed in their welfare coexisted with his fundamental inability to acknowledge the deception that made their relationships possible. As Rick established himself as an essential member of this alternate family structure, he created the foundation for years of adventures and crises that would test both his ability to protect the people he had grown to care about and his capacity to maintain relationships built on foundations that could not withstand complete honesty about his origins, his capabilities, or his psychological transformation during decades of revenge seeking that had failed to provide justice or healing. but had succeeded in making him into something that resembled the enemy he had spent so long trying to find and destroy across infinite realities that seemed designed to reward deception while punishing authentic human connection. The complex web of psychological dependencies and emotional manipulations that developed within the Smith family during Rick's gradual integration into their domestic structure represented perhaps the most sophisticated example of his ability to exploit intimate knowledge of human vulnerabilities while maintaining the illusion that his interventions served their best interests rather than his own desperate need for meaningful connections that could provide alternatives to the revenge obsession that had consumed his existence. Each family member's individual psychological weaknesses became instruments that Rick could manipulate with surgical precision, creating patterns of codependency that ensured their continued emotional investment in relationships built on foundations of systematic deception and carefully orchestrated crises. Beth's relationship with Rick was fundamentally shaped by the profound abandonment trauma she had experienced during childhood and adolescence, when Rick Prime had repeatedly disappeared for extended periods without explanation or commitment to maintaining paternal responsibilities, leaving her with unresolved psychological wounds that manifested as desperate need for validation from the father figure who had failed to provide consistent emotional support during her most vulnerable developmental years. Her intelligence and professional competence as a veterinary surgeon masked deep insecurities about her worth and lovability that made her pathologically susceptible to Rick's alternating patterns of approval and withdrawal, creating emotional dynamics that resembled addiction more than healthy family relationships. Rick's recognition of Beth's psychological vulnerabilities enabled him to position himself as the source of intellectual validation and paternal approval that she had craved since childhood, but his methods for maintaining her emotional dependence involved systematic manipulation of her self-esteem through carefully calibrated cycles of praise and criticism that kept her perpetually uncertain about her standing in his affections. The scientific projects and advanced technologies he shared with her provided temporary satisfaction for her intellectual curiosity, while also demonstrating capabilities that made ordinary human relationships seem inadequate by comparison, creating psychological conditions that made Beth increasingly isolated from potential sources of emotional support outside her relationship with Rick. The conversations Rick conducted with Beth about her marriage to Jerry served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple expression of paternal concern, as Rick systematically undermined her confidence in her husband's intellectual and emotional capabilities, while positioning himself as the only family member who truly understood and appreciated her potential. His casual dismissal of Jerry's contributions to their household and his pointed observations about Beth's superior intelligence created psychological pressure that made her question whether her marriage represented genuine partnership or simply settling for someone whose mediocrity provided comfortable predictability rather than stimulating challenge. But perhaps most disturbing was Rick's deliberate cultivation of Beth's darker impulses and moral flexibility through exposure to technologies and philosophical frameworks that normalized casual violence and systematic disregard for conventional ethical constraints, gradually eroding her capacity for independent moral reasoning while making her complicit in activities that would have horrified her earlier self. The weapons and inventions Rick created for her during childhood had been presented as expressions of parental love rather than tools for developing the kind of casual relationship with violence that would make her more psychologically compatible with Rick's own approach to problem solving through superior firepower. Jerry's role within the family structure was carefully orchestrated by Rick to provide a convenient target for everyone's frustrations, while also serving as living reminder of the intellectual and emotional limitations that Rick claimed to protect his loved ones from experiencing in their own development. Jerry's obvious inadequacies in comparison to Rick's capabilities made him an ideal scapegoat for family problems, while also providing Rick with opportunities to demonstrate his superior understanding of complex situations and his willingness to take decisive action when others remained paralyzed by conventional moral considerations or social expectations. The systematic humiliation that Jerry experienced at Rick's hands was designed not merely to express contempt for his perceived weaknesses, but to reinforce family hierarchies that positioned Rick as ultimate authority whose judgment could not be questioned by anyone who lacked comparable intellectual achievements and technological capabilities. Jerry's attempts to assert traditional paternal authority within his own household were consistently undermined by Rick's interventions that highlighted the futility of challenging someone whose scientific knowledge enabled him to reshape reality according to his preferences, without regard for social conventions or legal constraints. Rick's relationship with Jerry also served important psychological functions for Rick himself, providing him with a safe target for the rage and contempt he felt toward his own human limitations and the emotional vulnerabilities that had made him susceptible to the devastating grief that Rick Prime's bomb had inflicted. Jerry represented everything Rick despised about normal human existence, the contentment with mediocrity and acceptance of limitations that Rick associated with the philosophical frameworks that had made his original happiness possible, but had also left him defenseless against multiversal threats that operated beyond conventional moral categories. Summer's adolescent struggles with identity and social acceptance provided Rick with opportunities to position himself as understanding mentor who could offer technological solutions to problems that her parents were either unwilling or unable to address through conventional methods. But his interventions were carefully designed to create emotional dependence rather than genuine empowerment or personal growth. The adventures he occasionally included her in served to demonstrate that Rick alone among her family members possessed the capabilities and knowledge necessary to provide access to experiences that transcended the mundane limitations of ordinary teenage existence. The technologies Rick developed to enhance Summer's social status and physical appearance were presented as expressions of grandfatherly affection, but they also served to isolate her from peer relationships that might have provided alternative sources of validation and emotional support, independent of Rick's continued presence and approval. The casual way he solved problems that seemed insurmountable to normal human capabilities created expectations that Rick would always be available to provide technological fixes for difficulties that required emotional maturity and social skills to address through conventional methods. Rick's psychological manipulation of Summer was perhaps most evident in his systematic undermining of her relationships with her parents and friends through technologies and adventures that highlighted their inability to understand or address her real needs and desires, while simultaneously positioning himself as the only family member who truly appreciated her intelligence and potential. The pattern of creating problems that only Rick could solve became a recurring theme in Summer's development, making her increasingly dependent on his interventions, while eroding her confidence in her own ability to navigate social and emotional challenges without technological assistance. But it was Rick's relationship with Morty that represented both his most sophisticated manipulation and his most genuine emotional investment. As the boy's obvious intelligence and curiosity about scientific principles reminded Rick of his own daughter's childhood fascination with understanding how things worked, while Morty's social awkwardness and lack of confidence provided Rick with opportunities to serve as protector and mentor in ways that satisfied his need for meaningful purpose, beyond systematic revenge against enemies who might never be located among infinite realities. The adventures Rick designed for Morty served multiple psychological functions simultaneously, providing the boy with experiences that would build confidence and problem-solving capabilities, while also ensuring his emotional dependence on Rick's continued presence and protection from threats that existed far beyond anything normal teenage existence would expose him to. The interdimensional journeys they shared created bonds based on shared excitement and mutual reliance that felt authentic to both participants, but they were also carefully structured to reinforce Morty's understanding that Rick represented his primary source of protection from a multiverse filled with dangers that conventional authority figures could neither comprehend nor address. Rick's scientific education of Morty was motivated by genuine desire to share knowledge that might help the boy develop intellectual capabilities worthy of his obvious potential. But it was also designed to create psychological dependencies that made normal peer relationships and conventional educational experiences seem inadequate by comparison to the cosmic-scale adventures and advanced technologies that Rick could provide. The workshop sessions where they collaborated on projects became spaces where Rick could recreate aspects of his relationship with his original daughter while building new connections based on mutual fascination with scientific principles and technological possibilities. The most psychologically complex aspect of Rick's manipulation of Morty involved the careful calibration of danger and protection that characterized their adventures together, exposing the boy to threats that were genuinely lethal, while also ensuring that Rick's interventions would provide salvation that reinforced Morty's understanding of their relationship as essential to his continued survival. The pattern of crisis followed by rescue created emotional bonds that felt meaningful and authentic, while also serving Rick's need to position himself as indispensable to someone whose welfare he had grown to value above his own safety and comfort. But perhaps most disturbing was Rick's gradual corruption of Morty's moral development through exposure to situations that required violence and deception for survival, systematically eroding the boy's natural empathy and ethical intuitions, while making him complicit in activities that normalized casual disregard for the welfare of beings outside their immediate family circle. The philosophical frameworks Rick provided to justify their actions were sophisticated enough to seem reasonable, while also serving to eliminate moral constraints that might interfere with Rick's preferred methods for addressing obstacles and achieving objectives. The family dynamics that emerged from Rick's systematic manipulation of each member's psychological vulnerabilities created a household where everyone's emotional stability depended on maintaining relationships that served Rick's needs while providing the illusion that their welfare was his primary concern rather than simply fortunate coincidence with his own requirements for meaningful human connections. The love that developed between Rick and his adopted family members was genuine, but was also contaminated by power imbalances and systematic deception that made authentic intimacy impossible, while creating dependencies that would be difficult to survive if Rick chose to abandon them as casually as he had eliminated obstacles during his years of multiversal hunting. The toxic patterns that characterized the Smith family's internal relationships were not immediately apparent because they developed gradually and were often disguised as expressions of care and protection. But their cumulative effect was to create psychological conditions where each family member's sense of identity and worth became increasingly dependent on Rick's continued approval and presence. The adventures and technologies that Rick shared with them provided genuine excitement and expanded their understanding of what was possible beyond the limitations of ordinary human existence. But they also served to isolate them from potential sources of emotional support and validation that might have provided alternatives to the codependent relationships Rick was cultivating. The most tragic aspect of these family dynamics was that Rick's manipulation was not entirely conscious or deliberate, but was also driven by his own desperate need for connections that could provide meaning and purpose beyond the Proust revenge obsession that had structured his existence for decades, without delivering satisfaction or psychological healing. His love for Beth, Summer, and especially Morty was authentic emotional investment rather than purely strategic performance. But his capacity for healthy relationships had been so damaged by years of isolation and violence that he could only maintain connections through systematic control and manipulation that treated his family members as extensions of his own psychological needs rather than autonomous individuals, deserving of respect and honesty. The recognition that Rick was simultaneously victim and perpetrator in the complex web of emotional dysfunction that characterized the Smith household highlighted the tragic nature of his transformation from loving father into something capable of corrupting even the relationships he valued most deeply, demonstrating that his years of multiversal hunting had damaged not only his capacity for violence, but also his ability to engage authentically with people whose welfare he genuinely cared about preserving and enhancing through whatever means his superior intelligence and technological capabilities could provide. The citadel of Ricks represented the most ambitious attempt at interdimensional civilization that any version of Rick Sanchez had conceived or implemented. But it also embodied every psychological flaw and moral failing that characterized Rick's approach to organizing society according to principles of intellectual superiority and technological dominance, rather than cooperation, mutual respect, or consideration for the welfare of beings who lacked his specific capabilities and knowledge. The massive structure that floated in dimensional space beyond the boundaries of any single reality was simultaneously monument to Rick's collective genius and testament to their fundamental inability to create sustainable communities that served purposes beyond validating their own sense of superiority over less intellectually gifted beings. The political structure that governed Citadel society reflected the same narcissistic assumptions about natural hierarchy that characterized Rick's individual relationships with family members and colleagues, establishing formal institutional frameworks that treated intelligence as the primary qualification for authority, while systematically excluding voices and perspectives that might challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying Rick civilization. The Council of Ricks that served as the Citadel's governing body was composed entirely of versions of Rick who had demonstrated exceptional technological achievements or political acumen, but their collective decision-making processes were hampered by the same egotism and competitive dynamics that made cooperation difficult for individual Ricks in less formal settings. The economic systems that sustained Citadel operations were based on exploitation of beings who possessed capabilities that Ricks valued but lacked the intellectual or technological resources to demand equitable treatment in exchange for their contributions to the collective welfare of interdimensional society. The most systematic and morally reprehensible example of this exploitation was the institutionalized abuse of Mortys, whose psychological and neurological characteristics made them valuable as living camouflage for Rick brainwaves, while also rendering them vulnerable to manipulation and control by beings whose intellectual superiority enabled them to treat their supposed family members as expendable resources, rather than autonomous individuals deserving of protection and care. The Morty market that operated within the Citadel represented perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of Rick's capacity for systematic dehumanization of beings they claimed to love and protect, as alternate versions of Rick's grandson were bought, sold, and traded like livestock according to market principles that reduced complex psychological and emotional relationships to simple economic transactions. The casual brutality with which Mortis were treated by their Rick owners reflected the complete erosion of empathy and moral consideration that characterized advanced Rick society, demonstrating how intellectual development without corresponding ethical growth produced beings capable of monstrous behavior disguised as rational resource management. The simple Rick's Wafers factory provided another example of how Rick's civilization had learned to commodify and exploit the emotional experiences that normal beings considered most precious and meaningful, transforming genuine happiness and family connection into consumer products that could be mass-produced and distributed for profit. The Rick who had been selected for this process had committed no crime except achieving the kind of domestic contentment that most Ricks had abandoned in pursuit of cosmic-scale achievements and multiversal recognition. But his simple joy in family relationships made him valuable raw material for producing artificial happiness that could be consumed by Ricks who had sacrificed their own capacity for authentic emotional connection. The psychological torture involved in maintaining simple Rick in a state of perpetual artificial happiness, while harvesting his brain chemistry for commercial purposes, represented the logical endpoint of Rick's tendency to treat other beings as instruments for achieving their own objectives, rather than individuals whose welfare deserved consideration independent of their utility. The technology required to sustain this operation was sophisticated beyond anything that conventional science could produce, but it was applied toward purposes that reduced the most meaningful aspects of human existence to industrial processes that served no function except providing temporary satisfaction for beings who had lost the capacity for generating authentic happiness through normal relationships and activities. The systematic oppression of Mortys within Citadel society was justified through philosophical frameworks that portrayed their suffering as necessary sacrifice for maintaining the security and stability of interdimensional civilization. But these rationalizations could not disguise the fundamental cruelty of a system that treated sentient beings as disposable components in larger technological and social mechanisms. The Morty training facilities, work camps, and entertainment complexes that existed throughout the Citadel represented institutionalized abuse on a scale that exceeded anything individual Ricks had achieved through their personal relationships with their grandsons, demonstrating how collective organization could amplify rather than moderate the worst impulses of beings whose intelligence had not been tempered by corresponding moral development. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged among the Morty population were consistently suppressed through combinations of superior technology, psychological manipulation, and systematic violence that highlighted the impossibility of meaningful opposition to beings whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations by several orders of magnitude. The few Mortys who managed to organize effective resistance were either eliminated or co-opted into the system through methods that demonstrated Rick's sophisticated understanding of the psychological vulnerabilities that made their grandsons valuable as companions, while also rendering them susceptible to control and exploitation. But perhaps most disturbing was the way that Rick society had normalized and institutionalized relationships that individual Ricks often experienced as genuinely meaningful connections with their Morty companions, creating cognitive dissonance that enabled systematic abuse while maintaining the psychological fiction that they were protecting and nurturing beings they cared about deeply. The same Rick who might risk his life to save his particular Morty from danger could simultaneously support political and economic systems that condemned countless other Mortys to lives of exploitation and suffering, compartmentalizing their emotional investments in ways that prevented recognition of the fundamental contradictions inherent in their approach to family relationships. The bureaucratic structures that administered Citadel operations reflected the same inefficiencies and institutional pathologies that characterized conventional government organizations, but with the added complications that arose from attempting to coordinate the activities of beings whose intellectual arrogance made them resistant to authority and whose technological capabilities enabled them to pursue individual agendas that might conflict with collective objectives. The paperwork, regulations, and administrative procedures that governed daily life within the Citadel were simultaneously necessary for maintaining order among thousands of Ricks and symptomatic of the creative stagnation that resulted from organizing genius. According to conventional, institutional models, the cultural institutions that developed within Citadel society reflected Rick's collective inability to create meaningful art, entertainment, or intellectual discourse that transcended their obsession with demonstrating superiority over less capable beings, resulting in forms of cultural expression that were technically sophisticated but emotionally sterile and philosophically impoverished. The museums, theaters, and educational facilities that existed within the Citadel were filled with achievements that showcased Rick intelligence while failing to address fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, or the ethical implications of their technological capabilities and social organization. Rick Cohn, 37's relationship with Citadel society was complicated by his recognition that the other Ricks had organized primarily as defensive measure against his own campaign of systematic murder across infinite realities, making him simultaneously the external threat that had motivated their cooperation and potential member, whose capabilities and knowledge might benefit their collective security and technological development. His reputation as the Rick who had killed more alternate versions of himself than any other individual made him both feared and respected within Citadel culture, but it also highlighted the fundamental violence that underlay even their most sophisticated attempts at peaceful coexistence. The invitation for Rick Cohn, 37, to join Citadel society was extended with genuine recognition that his integration might provide benefits for both himself and the existing Rick community, but it was also motivated by practical understanding that containing his violence within institutional frameworks would be preferable to continued external threat from someone whose capabilities had proven difficult to counter through conventional defensive measures. The membership they offered represented an attempt to transform enemy into ally, while also providing Rick Cohn, 37, with community among beings who could understand and appreciate his intellectual achievements without being intimidated by his capacity for casual violence. Rick's rejection of Citadel membership reflected his fundamental inability to value any objective except his continued hunt for Rick Prime, but it also demonstrated his recognition that joining Rick's society would require him to accept philosophical compromises and institutional constraints that might interfere with his single-minded pursuit of revenge. The community that other Ricks had created through cooperation seemed like betrayal of the mission that had consumed his identity for decades, diluting focus and emotional investment that should remain concentrated on finding and eliminating the specific Rick who had murdered his family. But Rick's dismissal of Citadel society also reflected his accurate assessment that their institutional structures were designed to perpetuate rather than challenge the same psychological pathologies that had characterized his own transformation from loving father into multiversal predator, recognizing that organized Rick civilization represented systematic amplification of the worst aspects of their shared personality rather than evolution toward more ethical and sustainable forms of social organization. The bureaucratic efficiency with which they had institutionalized exploitation and abuse made them more dangerous rather than less threatening to the welfare of beings who lacked their intellectual and technological advantages. The technological achievements that Rick's civilization had accomplished through collective effort exceeded anything that individual Ricks could produce independently, but these advances were directed primarily toward maintaining their dominance over less capable beings, rather than addressing fundamental questions about how intelligence should be applied toward creating more just and sustainable forms of multiversal society. The weapons, surveillance systems, and control mechanisms that protected Citadel security were marvels of interdimensional engineering, but they served purposes that reduced other conscious beings to obstacles that needed to be managed, rather than individuals whose welfare deserved consideration in its own right. The educational systems that existed within the Citadel were designed to produce more Ricks, rather than to develop forms of knowledge that might challenge or improve upon existing. Rick approaches to science, technology, and social organization, creating intellectual monoculture that stifled genuine innovation, while reinforcing existing assumptions about natural hierarchy and the legitimacy of exploiting beings who lacked comparable analytical capabilities. The training programs that prepared young Ricks for full participation in Citadel society emphasized technical skills and competitive achievement, while systematically discouraging empathy, ethical reflection, or consideration for the welfare of non-Rick beings. The ultimate tragedy of Citadel society was not its eventual destruction, but rather its success in demonstrating that even the most intelligent beings in the multiverse remained capable of creating institutional structures that perpetuated suffering and injustice on cosmic scales when their intellectual development was not balanced by corresponding growth in wisdom, compassion, and moral imagination. The civilization that Ricks had built represented the logical endpoint of organizing society according to principles of intellectual superiority rather than mutual respect and collective welfare, proving that genius without ethical constraint produced results that were sophisticated in their technical implementation but monstrous in their human consequences. The legacy of the Citadel would persist even after its physical destruction, serving as reminder that intelligence alone was insufficient foundation for creating sustainable communities, and that the capacity for brilliant analysis could coexist with fundamental moral blindness that rendered even the most advanced beings capable of casual cruelty and systematic oppression. Disguised as rational resource management and necessary security measures, in a multiverse filled with potential threats to their continued dominance and technological supremacy. The central finite curve represented perhaps Rick's most audacious and psychologically revealing achievement, a technological monument to his fundamental inability to accept the possibility that infinite realities might contain versions of existence where his intellectual superiority was not the dominant force shaping events, outcomes, and the basic structure of how consciousness related to the physical universe. The mathematical complexity required to identify and isolate all dimensions where Rick Sanchez was the smartest being in existence exceeded anything that normal human intelligence should have been capable of conceiving, requiring analytical frameworks that operated beyond conventional understanding of dimensional physics, while also demanding computational resources that could process infinite variables simultaneously across countless parallel realities. The construction of this dimensional barrier had required Rick to survey the entire accessible multiverse and categorize every possible reality according to criteria that placed his own cognitive capabilities at the center of cosmic significance, creating a prison that confined not just himself, but every other conscious being within the selected dimensions to existence within Rick's carefully curated version of what reality should contain. The billions of Mortys, Beths, Jerrys, and Summers who lived within the central finite curve were unknowing prisoners in a cosmic-scale experiment designed to ensure that Rick would never have to confront evidence of his own intellectual limitations or acknowledge the possibility that other forms of consciousness might possess capabilities that exceeded his own in ways that would challenge his fundamental assumptions about natural hierarchy and the relationship between intelligence and authority. The philosophical implications of the central finite curve extended far beyond simple narcissistic need for validation, representing systematic attempt to reshape the fundamental nature of existence according to Rick's psychological requirements, rather than accepting the inherent randomness and uncertainty that characterize genuine multiversal reality. By eliminating all dimensions where beings more intelligent than Rick might exist, he had created an artificial universe where his genius would always be supreme, where his technological achievements would always represent the pinnacle of what was possible, and where his moral and ethical choices would never be challenged by perspectives that might possess superior wisdom or understanding. The ethical violations involved in constructing the central finite curve were staggering in their scope and implications, as Rick had essentially condemned countless billions of conscious beings to lives constrained by his personal limitations without their knowledge or consent, trapping them within realities that had been artificially selected to prevent them from experiencing forms of existence that might transcend the boundaries of what Rick's intelligence could comprehend or control. The dimensions that existed beyond the curve contained possibilities for growth, development, and achievement that Rick had systematically denied to everyone within his prison, including himself, creating conditions that guaranteed intellectual and moral stagnation disguised as stability and security. The technological mechanisms that maintained the central finite curve required constant monitoring and adjustment to prevent dimensional drift that might allow access to realities beyond Rick's carefully selected parameters, demanding resources and attention that could have been directed towards solving genuine problems or advancing knowledge in ways that benefited all conscious beings rather than simply protecting Rick's ego from contact with evidence of his own limitations. The energy expenditure necessary to sustain such massive interdimensional engineering represented perhaps the greatest waste of intellectual and technological resources in the history of multiversal civilization. But perhaps most disturbing was the way the central finite curve had enabled Rick to rationalize his worst impulses and most destructive behaviors by ensuring that he would never encounter evidence that alternative approaches to power, knowledge, and relationships might prove more effective or ethically justifiable than his own methods. Within the artificially constrained multiverse he had created, Rick's casual violence and systematic exploitation of other beings could always be justified as necessary responses to threats and challenges that required his superior capabilities to address, since no being within the curve possessed knowledge or abilities that might suggest more constructive alternatives. The psychological comfort that Rick derived from knowing that his intelligence was guaranteed to be supreme within his accessible universe came at the cost of genuine growth and development that might have occurred through exposure to beings whose capabilities exceeded his own in ways that could have challenged and improved his understanding of science, ethics, and the possibilities for conscious existence. By protecting himself from intellectual humiliation, Rick had also eliminated opportunities for learning and evolution that might have transformed him into something more than the brilliant but fundamentally limited being he remained throughout his existence within the curve. The impact of the central finite curve on other Ricks was equally devastating, as it trapped them within realities where their shared psychological pathologies and intellectual limitations were never challenged. by contact with forms of consciousness that might have provided examples of more healthy and constructive approaches to using advanced capabilities for collective benefit rather than personal aggrandizement. The citadel of Ricks that had formed within the curve represented not genuine civilization, but rather elaborate echo chamber where the same flawed assumptions about intelligence, power, and moral responsibility were endlessly reinforced without possibility of correction through exposure to alternative perspectives. The systematic oppression that characterized Rick's society within the central finite curve was enabled and justified by the artificial scarcity of intellectual challenges that might have forced Ricks to develop more sophisticated ethical frameworks for relating to beings who possess different but potentially valuable capabilities and perspectives. The exploitation of Mortys, the casual destruction of entire civilizations, and the reduction of complex social and moral questions to simple technical problems were all made possible by Rick's elimination of dimensions where such behaviors might be recognized as symptoms of intellectual and moral immaturity, rather than expressions of natural superiority. The discovery of the central finite curve's existence represented perhaps the most profound violation of trust and autonomy that any conscious being could perpetrate against others, as Rick had essentially stolen the birthright of infinite possibility from everyone within his selected realities without their knowledge or consent. The beings who lived within the curve had been denied access to versions of themselves who might have achieved greater happiness, wisdom, or fulfillment in dimensions where Rick's influence was not the dominant factor shaping the development of consciousness and civilization. The maintenance of the central finite curve required Rick to continuously monitor and manipulate the fundamental structure of reality itself, making constant adjustments to prevent dimensional barriers from weakening or allowing access to realities beyond his control. But this technological achievement also represented the ultimate expression of the same controlling and manipulative impulses that characterized his personal relationships with family members and colleagues. The need to micromanage existence on cosmic scales revealed the depth of Rick's inability to tolerate uncertainty, randomness, or the possibility that events might unfold according to principles that exceeded his understanding or control. The mathematical elegance of the central finite curve's construction could not disguise the fundamental cowardice and insecurity that had motivated its creation, as Rick had essentially admitted that his intellectual achievements were meaningful only when compared to beings of lesser capability, rather than being valuable in their own right, regardless of their relative ranking within infinite possibility. By ensuring that he would always be the smartest person in any accessible universe, Rick had also guaranteed that his intelligence would never be tested or refined through genuine challenges that might have led to authentic growth and development. The philosophical questions raised by the central finite curve extended to fundamental issues about the nature of identity, free will, and moral responsibility. In contexts where the basic parameters of existence had been artificially manipulated to serve the psychological needs of a single individual whose capabilities enabled him to reshape reality according to his personal preferences. The beings trapped within the curve were living lives that seemed authentic and meaningful to them, but their experiences were ultimately constrained by limitations they could never perceive or challenge, making their choices and achievements less genuine than they appeared. The tragedy of the central finite curve was not merely that it represented monstrous violation of cosmic justice and individual autonomy, but that it also prevented Rick himself from achieving the kind of genuine greatness that might have been possible if he had possessed the courage to test his capabilities against beings whose intelligence might have exceeded his own in ways that could have inspired rather than threatened him. By protecting himself from intellectual competition, Rick had also eliminated opportunities for collaboration and mutual growth that might have led to achievements far beyond anything he could accomplish within the artificial constraints he had imposed on reality. The energy and resources that Rick had devoted to maintaining the central finite curve represented perhaps the greatest misallocation of intellectual and technological capabilities in the history of conscious existence, as abilities that could have been used to solve genuine problems or expand the possibilities for all conscious beings were instead directed toward protecting one individual's ego from contact with evidence of his own limitations. The same genius that had enabled Rick to construct dimensional barriers could have been applied toward creating technologies and social systems that enhanced rather than constrained the development of consciousness across infinite realities. The discovery that Rick had constructed the central finite curve also revealed the extent to which his claims about protecting his family and advancing scientific knowledge were ultimately subordinated to his need for psychological comfort and validation, demonstrating that even his most apparently altruistic motivations were contaminated by narcissistic impulses that treated other conscious beings as instruments for achieving his own emotional stability rather than individuals whose welfare deserved consideration in its own right. The man who claimed to love his family had imprisoned them within artificially limited realities to ensure that they would never encounter evidence of his intellectual or moral inadequacy. The central finite curve represented the logical endpoint of Rick's approach to solving problems through superior technology and analytical capability, rather than through emotional growth, ethical development, or genuine collaboration with other conscious beings, proving that even infinite intelligence remained insufficient for creating meaningful existence when it was not balanced by wisdom, compassion, and respect for the autonomy and dignity of others. The prison Rick had created for himself and countless others demonstrated that the capacity for brilliant analysis could coexist with fundamental moral blindness that rendered even the most advanced beings capable of monstrous behavior, disguised as rational resource management and necessary security measures. The ultimate irony of the central finite curve was that Rick's success in creating a universe where his intelligence was guaranteed to be supreme had also guaranteed that his existence would remain fundamentally empty and meaningless, since achievements and relationships that occurred within artificially constrained parameters could never provide the genuine satisfaction and validation that might have resulted from authentic engagement with the full complexity and uncertainty of multiversal existence, leaving him trapped within the very prison he had constructed to protect himself from confronting his own limitations and failures. As conscious being, seeking meaning and connection in infinite cosmos that seemed designed to humble rather than validate the pretensions of any individual intelligence. The pattern of interdimensional adventures that characterized Rick's relationship with his adopted family appeared on the surface to provide educational enrichment and exciting experiences that transcended the mundane limitations of single-dimensional existence. But each expedition carried hidden costs that accumulated over time into psychological damage and moral corruption that would eventually prove more devastating than any immediate physical dangers they encountered during their travels. Across infinite realities, Rick's approach to adventure planning consistently prioritized immediate gratification and problem-solving efficiency over long-term consequences for the emotional and ethical development of family members who lacked his experience with multiversal travel and its implications for understanding identity, mortality, and moral responsibility. The love potion incident that transformed their first major crisis into template for Rick's casual approach to abandoning realities when they became inconvenient represented perhaps the clearest example of how Rick's superior technological capabilities enabled him to treat catastrophic failures as minor setbacks that could be resolved through dimensional replacement, rather than accepting responsibility for consequences and working to repair damage he had caused through reckless experimentation. The chemical weapon that Rick created to help Morty attract Jessica's romantic attention was engineered with the same casual disregard for safety protocols that characterized his approach to most family problems, applying advanced biochemistry to achieve desired outcomes without adequate consideration for potential side effects or unintended interactions with environmental factors. The escalation from simple romantic enhancement to global pandemic occurred with terrifying rapidity as Rick's love potion interacted with human biology in ways that his theoretical knowledge had failed to predict, transforming the entire population of Earth into aggressive creatures whose obsession with Morty represented existential threat, not just to his personal safety, but to the continued survival of human civilization as recognizable social and cultural institution. The irony was particularly cruel that Rick's attempt to help his grandson experience romantic success had instead created a world where Morty was pursued by beings who were no longer recognizably human in their behavior, psychology, or capacity for normal social interaction. Rick's response to the catastrophe he had created was characteristically analytical and emotionally detached, focusing on technical solutions to immediate threats rather than grappling with moral implications of his role in destroying the lives and identities of billions of innocent people who had committed no greater crime than existing in the same reality, where Rick had chosen to conduct dangerous experiments without adequate safety precautions. His primary concern was not the suffering of the infected population or the collapse of social institutions that had taken millennia to develop, but rather the inconvenience that the situation posed for his and Morty's continued comfortable existence within that particular dimensional framework. The antidote that Rick developed to counteract the love potion's effects demonstrated his remarkable capability for rapid problem-solving under pressure, but it also revealed his fundamental inability to acknowledge that some problems required acceptance of responsibility and systematic effort to repair damage, rather than quick technological fixes that eliminated immediate symptoms while creating new categories of suffering. The cure he administered transformed the love-obsessed population into horrifying genetic mutations that retained human consciousness while being trapped in bodies that could no longer support normal biological functions or social interactions, arguably creating worse suffering than the original infection had produced. The decision to abandon their ruined dimension, rather than attempting to develop additional treatments that might have restored the mutated population to normal human form, was made with the same casual efficiency that Rick applied to discarding broken laboratory equipment when replacement proved more convenient than repair. The process of locating a suitable replacement reality required only that Rick identify dimensions where their alternate selves had died through unrelated accidents, enabling them to assume the identities and relationships of their deceased counterparts without having to explain their sudden appearance to family members who would have expected different personal histories and behavioral patterns. For Morty, the experience of burying his own corpse and assuming the life of his dead alternate self represented fundamental break with everything he had understood about the nature of personal identity and the significance of individual existence, forcing him to confront questions about continuity of consciousness and meaning that no adolescent should have been expected to process successfully without extensive psychological support and guidance. The casual way that Rick dismissed these existential concerns as irrelevant philosophical speculation demonstrated how completely his years of interdimensional travel had severed his connection to normal human responses to mortality and the replacement of authentic relationships with carefully constructed simulations. The new family that accepted Rick and Morty in their replacement dimension was identical to the one they had abandoned in every significant respect, except for the crucial detail that these were not the same people who had developed relationships with them over months or years of shared experiences, creating additional layers of deception that further complicated Rick's already strained relationship with emotional authenticity. Beth's expressions of maternal love were directed toward a version of Morty who had never existed in this dimension, while Jerry's paternal concerns were based on experiences with a grandson who had died before Rick and Morty's arrival, making every family interaction a performance that required them to simulate relationships they had never actually developed with these particular individuals. The psychological impact of dimensional abandonment and identity replacement was cumulative rather than immediately apparent, creating trauma that manifested gradually as Rick and Morty became increasingly detached from normal human concerns about consequences, permanence, and the value of individual relationships that could be replaced when they became damaged or inconvenient. The knowledge that infinite alternate versions of their family members existed across dimensional boundaries made it psychologically easier to treat any particular version as expendable when circumstances required relocation to more favorable realities. But this convenience came at the cost of genuine emotional investment in the welfare of specific individuals. The pattern that emerged from their first dimensional abandonment established template for Rick's approach to all subsequent crises that threatened their comfortable existence within whatever reality they currently inhabited, demonstrating his consistent preference for escape and replacement over acceptance of responsibility and systematic effort to address problems through methods that respected the autonomy and welfare of beings who lacked his technological capabilities. Each subsequent adventure carried implicit understanding that failure or catastrophic consequences could be resolved through portal travel to dimensions where their alternate selves had resolved similar problems more successfully or had died before encountering equivalent difficulties. The Cronenberg dimension they had abandoned continued to exist, with its mutated population struggling to survive in conditions that Rick's experiments had created, but their suffering became abstract rather than immediate concern once Rick and Morty were no longer forced to witness daily reminders of the consequences their actions had produced. The ability to escape from realities where their choices had generated negative outcomes enabled Rick to avoid psychological consequences of his casual approach to experimentation and problem-solving, maintaining his conviction that superior intelligence justified disregard for conventional moral constraints without having to confront evidence of the human cost such attitudes produced when applied consistently over time. The interdimensional customs checkpoint that Rick and Morty encountered during subsequent adventures revealed the existence of bureaucratic institutions that attempted to regulate travel between realities and prevent the kind of casual smuggling and illegal importation that characterized Rick's approach to acquiring resources and materials from dimensions where they were more readily available. The sophisticated technology that detected contraband concealed within human body cavities demonstrated that other beings had developed comparable capabilities for interdimensional monitoring and control, but Rick's methods for evading such oversight typically involve violence and destruction rather than cooperation with legitimate regulatory frameworks. The weapons training that Rick provided Morty during their escape from interdimensional law enforcement represented systematic corruption of his grandson's moral development through exposure to situations where survival required killing sentient beings who were performing legitimate professional duties rather than threatening innocent people or engaging in criminal activities. The casual way that Rick presented lethal violence as routine aspect of interdimensional travel normalized approaches to conflict resolution that would have horrified Morty's earlier self, while also demonstrating Rick's complete inability to distinguish between necessary self-defense and convenient elimination of obstacles to his preferred activities. The mega seeds that had motivated their first interdimensional expedition served no purpose except enhancing Rick's existing technological capabilities in ways that provided marginal improvements to equipment that already exceeded anything that conventional science could produce. But the risks involved in acquiring these materials far exceeded any practical benefits they might have provided for addressing genuine problems or improving conditions for Rick's family members. The expedition represented Rick's tendency to pursue objectives that satisfied his intellectual curiosity and competitive instincts, rather than serving clear humanitarian purposes or addressing specific needs that could not be met through less dangerous methods. The progressive desensitization that Morty experienced through repeated exposure to violence, moral ambiguity, and casual disregard for the welfare of beings outside their immediate family circle represented perhaps the most damaging long-term consequence of Rick's approach to adventure planning and educational methodology. The boy, who had initially been traumatized by burying his own corpse, gradually developed capacity for participating in activities that would have seemed unthinkable to his earlier self, demonstrating how systematic exposure to extreme situations could erode natural empathy and ethical intuition through processes that felt like personal growth and increased sophistication rather than moral corruption. The philosophical frameworks that Rick provided to justify their increasingly questionable activities were sophisticated enough to seem reasonable to someone whose moral education had been systematically corrupted through exposure to situations where conventional ethical guidelines proved inadequate for ensuring survival. But these rationalizations served primarily to eliminate psychological barriers to behavior that served Rick's convenience, rather than addressing genuine moral complexities that required careful consideration and ethical reflection. The nihilistic worldview that Rick promoted was presented as objective truth discovered through superior analytical capabilities, rather than defensive psychological mechanism designed to protect him from acknowledging the human cost of his choices and lifestyle. The family members who remained behind during Rick and Morty's interdimensional expeditions experienced their own forms of psychological damage through constant anxiety about their safety, combined with growing recognition that normal human concerns and social relationships seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the cosmic-scale adventures and crises that now dominated household dynamics. Beth's medical career, Jerry's professional aspirations, and Summer's academic and social development all became secondary considerations that could be interrupted or abandoned whenever Rick decided that family circumstances required immediate dimensional relocation or extended absence for adventures that served his research interests rather than their collective welfare. The technologies that Rick introduced into their household to facilitate interdimensional travel and provide protection from multiversal threats gradually transformed their home from normal suburban residence into fortress equipped with weapons and surveillance systems that reflected Rick's assumption that their family was constantly threatened by enemies and rivals who possessed capabilities comparable to his own. The casual presence of lethal devices and exotic materials that could eliminate entire populations created domestic environment where normal childhood development and family relationships became impossible to maintain according to conventional social expectations and psychological needs. The most insidious aspect of Rick's approach to family adventures was his systematic erosion of boundaries between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment, gradually exposing his loved ones to threats that exceeded anything that responsible guardians should have considered appropriate, while presenting these experiences as gifts that expanded their understanding and capabilities beyond what ordinary existence could provide. The excitement and stimulation that Rick's adventures generated were genuine and compelling, but they also created psychological dependencies that made normal human activities seem boring and meaningless by comparison to cosmic-scale conflicts and interdimensional exploration. The pattern of crisis creation, followed by spectacular rescue that characterized many of Rick's adventures, served his psychological need to position himself as indispensable protector, whose superior capabilities justified his pace, authority over family decisions, and his casual disregard for their preferences about risk exposure and lifestyle choices. But these demonstrations of his protective value came at the cost of creating genuine dangers that would not have existed if Rick had chosen more conventional approaches to family entertainment and education. The problems that Rick solved for his family were often problems that his presence and activities had created in the first place, making his protection necessary, primarily because his lifestyle and enemies posed constant threats to their safety and well-being. The cumulative effect of Rick's approach to interdimensional adventure was systematic destruction of his family's capacity for normal human relationships and conventional social integration, as their shared experiences of cosmic horror and multiversal crisis made them increasingly isolated from neighbors, colleagues, and peers who could not understand or relate to their casual familiarity with violence, moral complexity, and existential threats that exceeded normal human comprehension. The family that Rick had joined through deception and manipulation was gradually transformed into reflection of his own alienation from ordinary human concerns and conventional approaches to meaning, purpose, and interpersonal connection, ensuring that they would remain emotionally dependent on relationships with someone whose protection they needed, primarily because his presence in their lives had made such protection necessary in the first place. The revelation that would expose the deepest layers of Rick's psychological architecture and force a fundamental reckoning with decades of accumulated deception began with evil Morty's infiltration and systematic takeover of the Plans, Citadel's governing structures, representing not merely political coup, but rather comprehensive analysis and exploitation of the institutional vulnerabilities that characterized Rick's society across infinite dimensions. Evil Morty's rise to power within the Council of Ricks had been accomplished through patient manipulation of existing bureaucratic processes and careful exploitation of the same narcissistic assumptions that made Rick's civilization simultaneously sophisticated and fundamentally unstable, demonstrating strategic thinking that exceeded anything individual Ricks had achieved during their years of competitive isolation. The campaign that brought evil Morty to the presidency of Citadel Society was conducted with methodical precision that revealed intimate understanding of Rick psychology and the specific weaknesses that made even the most intelligent beings in the multiverse susceptible to manipulation by someone who possessed sufficient knowledge of their motivations and behavioral patterns. His political messaging combined appeals to Rick's superiority with subtle criticisms of existing institutional frameworks that had failed to provide adequate security against external threats like Rick Cone 37, creating electoral coalition that supported reform without recognizing the radical nature of the changes being proposed through carefully disguised revolutionary rhetoric. But Evil Morty's true objectives extended far beyond simple political control of Rick's civilization to encompass complete transformation of the fundamental relationship between Rick's and Morty's across all accessible dimensions, representing systematic reversal of power dynamics that had characterized their species' interactions since the first. Rick had discovered the neurological compatibility that made Morty's valuable as camouflage and companions. The technologies that Evil Morty had developed during his years of apparent cooperation with Rick Authority were designed not merely to enhance Morty capabilities, but to provide forms of superiority that would enable systematic oppression and elimination of beings who had treated them as expendable resources rather than autonomous individuals deserving of respect and protection. The brain-scanning device that Evil Morty employed to extract Rick Cone 37's memories represented perhaps the most sophisticated neurotechnology that any being within the central finite curve had developed, enabling complete download and analysis of psychological content that Rick had accumulated during decades of multiversal travel and systematic violence. The process was conducted with clinical efficiency that demonstrated Evil Morty's complete emotional detachment from his victim's suffering, while also revealing the extent to which his own experiences had transformed him into something capable of inflicting forms of psychological torture that exceeded anything conventional Ricks had conceived during their years of casual cruelty toward their Morty companions. The information that Evil Morty extracted from Rick's consciousness provided him with comprehensive understanding of the central finite curve's construction and maintenance, but more importantly revealed the fundamental philosophical assumptions and psychological motivations that had driven Rick to imprison infinite populations within artificially constrained realities designed to protect his ego from contact with evidence of superior intelligence or alternative approaches to organizing multiversal society. The mathematical frameworks underlying the dimensional barrier were elegant in their complexity, but horrifying in their implications for the autonomy and potential development of beings who had been condemned to existence within Rick's carefully curated version of what reality should contain. The revelation of the central finite curve's existence transformed Evil Morty's understanding of his situation from local conflict with particularly dangerous individual Rick to recognition that he was imprisoned within cosmic-scale manifestation of Rick narcissism and psychological inadequacy that affected every conscious being within infinite accessible realities. The discovery that his entire existence had been predetermined by Rick's need to avoid intellectual competition and moral challenge created rage that transcended personal grievance to encompass systematic rejection of all institutional structures and philosophical frameworks that Rick's had created to justify their dominance over less analytically capable beings. But perhaps most psychologically devastating for both Rick and Morty was Evil Morty's presentation of evidence documenting the systematic replaceability and expendability that characterized their relationship across multiple dimensions, demonstrating that Rick's claims about genuine emotional investment in his grandson's welfare were contradicted by behavioral patterns that treated individual Mortys as interchangeable components in larger technological and Morty's psychological systems. The brain scan footage that showed Rick casually disposing of Morty corpses across numerous realities was presented not merely as evidence of Rick's capacity for violence, but as proof that even his most important relationships were pace for the ultimately subordinated to practical considerations about convenience and efficiency. Morty's confrontation with visual evidence of his own systematic replacement across dimensional boundaries forced him to acknowledge that his sense of being special or uniquely valued in Rick's affections, was illusory, based on incomplete information about the broader patterns of behavior that characterized Rick's approach to family relationships and adventure partnerships throughout the multiverse. The recognition that countless other versions of himself had served similar functions for their respective Ricks created existential crisis that challenged everything Morty had believed about identity, meaning, and the significance of individual consciousness within infinite realities where every possible variation was being enacted simultaneously. The philosophical implications of Evil Morty's revelations extended beyond immediate questions about Rick and Morty's relationship to encompass fundamental challenges to concepts of free will, moral responsibility, and meaningful choice within artificially constrained realities, where the basic parameters of existence had been manipulated to serve Rick's psychological needs rather than reflecting natural development of consciousness and civilization. The beings trapped within the central finite curve were living lives that seemed authentic and purposeful to them, but their experiences were ultimately limited by barriers they could never perceive or challenge, making their achievements and relationships less genuine than they appeared. Evil Morty's plan to destroy the central finite curve represented not merely an escape attempt, but rather philosophical statement about the relationship between intelligence and moral authority, rejecting Rick claims that superior analytical capabilities justified systematic oppression of beings who possessed different but potentially valuable forms of consciousness and creativity. The technologies required to breach dimensional barriers that Rick had constructed exceeded anything that conventional Morty intelligence should have been capable of developing, demonstrating that exposure to Rick's society had accelerated Evil Morty's intellectual development while also corrupting his capacity for empathy and ethical reasoning in ways that made him as dangerous as the enemies he sought to eliminate. The countdown to the central finite curve's destruction was accompanied by systematic revelation of Rick's most carefully guarded secrets and vulnerabilities, as Evil Morty used his stolen knowledge to maximum advantage in undermining both Rick's self-image and his relationship with the family members who provided his primary source of meaning and emotional stability. The casual way that Rick had treated multiversal genocide and systematic oppression of infinite populations as necessary security measures was presented as evidence that his claims about protecting his loved ones were ultimately secondary to his need for psychological comfort and validation through guaranteed intellectual superiority. The Citadel's transformation into weapon of mass destruction represented Evil Morty's most audacious technological achievement, converting the entire infrastructure of Rick's civilization into delivery system for the concentrated violence necessary to breach dimensional barriers that had confined him throughout his development from innocent child into cosmic-scale threat, capable of matching Rick's own capacity for systematic destruction. The engineering required to weaponize structures, originally designed for governmental and residential purposes, exceeded anything individual Rick had accomplished, but it also demonstrated how completely Evil Morty had internalized Rick approaches to problem-solving through superior firepower rather than negotiation or cooperation. The systematic elimination of Rick authority that accompanied the Citadel's final activation served both practical and symbolic purposes, removing potential sources of opposition to Evil Morty's escape, while also providing cathartic reversal of power dynamics that had characterized Rick-Morty relationships across infinite dimensions within the central finite curve. The deaths of countless Ricks during the dimensional breach were not merely collateral damage, but deliberate punishment for their participation in maintaining systems of oppression that had condemned countless Mortys to lives of exploitation and abuse disguised as protection and guidance. Rick and Morty's desperate escape from the collapsing Citadel provided them with direct experience of the chaos and destruction that resulted from challenging fundamental structures that had organized their existence. But their survival also forced them to confront questions about complicity and moral responsibility that Rick had successfully avoided through decades of rationalization and selective attention to evidence. The technological superiority that had enabled Rick's casual approach to problem solving was revealed as inadequate for addressing crises that required acknowledgement of past mistakes and systematic effort to repair damage that could not be resolved through portal travel to more convenient realities. The loss of portal fluid that stranded Rick and Morty in space without means of interdimensional travel represented symbolic severing of Rick's connection to the technological capabilities that had enabled his godlike control over his environment and relationships, forcing him to confront the possibility that his influence and authority might not be permanent or inevitable aspects of his identity. The practical vulnerability created by their technological limitations also highlighted how dependent Rick's family relationships had become on his ability to provide protection and resources that exceeded normal human capabilities, raising questions about whether genuine emotional connections could survive without the power imbalances that had characterized their interactions. Evil Morty's final departure through the breach in the central finite curve was accomplished with technological sophistication that demonstrated his successful evolution beyond the intellectual and moral limitations that had constrained his development within Rick-dominated reality. But his escape also represented rejection of all possibilities for cooperation or reconciliation with beings whose fundamental psychology remained shaped by the same narcissistic assumptions that had motivated construction of the Pay's dimensional prison. His observation that everyone eventually becomes evil from Rick's perspective served as indictment of philosophical frameworks that treated moral complexity as evidence of corruption, rather than recognition that ethical development required exposure to perspectives that challenged, rather than validated, existing assumptions. The destruction of the central finite curve created opportunities for genuine growth and moral development that had been systematically denied to beings trapped within Rick's artificial constraints, but it also exposed them to forms of accountability and consequence that Rick's dimensional barriers had been designed to prevent through careful curation of accessible realities. The collapse of institutional structures that had protected Rick's civilization from external challenge forced survivors to develop new approaches to organizing society and individual relationships that could not rely on guaranteed intellectual superiority or technological dominance over potentially hostile, alternate versions of themselves. The philosophical questions raised by Evil Morty's revelations and successful escape could not be resolved through Rick's normal methods of analytical problem-solving or technological innovation, requiring forms of emotional intelligence and ethical reasoning that his years of multiversal dominance had systematically discouraged in favor of approaches that prioritized efficiency and control over genuine understanding or cooperative solutions to shared challenges. The recognition that his most fundamental assumptions about intelligence, authority, and moral responsibility had been challenged by someone whose capabilities had been shaped through exposure to Rick's own methods created cognitive dissonance that no amount of superior analysis could resolve satisfactorily. The aftermath of the central finite curve's destruction left Rick and Morty facing prospect of existence in multiverse where Rick's intellectual superiority was no longer guaranteed, and his technological advantages had been severely compromised, while also forcing them to rebuild their relationship on more honest foundations that acknowledged the extent to which Rick's need for control had corrupted his capacity for genuine emotional connection with people whose welfare he claimed to value above his own safety and comfort. The love that connected them remained real, despite years of manipulation and deception. But its continuation would require fundamental changes in how Rick understood his role as protector and mentor to beings whose autonomy he had systematically undermined through superior knowledge and casual disregard for their capacity to make informed decisions about their own lives and relationships. The psychological void that opened within Rick following the successful completion of his decades-long quest for revenge was not the satisfying closure he had anticipated, but rather a devastating emptiness that made his original grief over Diane and Beth's deaths seem manageable by comparison as the structure of meaning and purpose that had organized his existence. Since the bombing was suddenly eliminated without replacement by any alternative framework for understanding why continued existence might be worthwhile or meaningful. The depression that settled over Rick in the aftermath of Rick Prime's death was qualitatively different from the acute mourning he had experienced immediately after losing his family, representing instead the chronic despair of someone who had discovered that achieving his ultimate objective provided no satisfaction, healing, or sense that cosmic justice had been restored through sufficient application of violence and determination. The alliance with evil Morty that had enabled Rick's final confrontation with his nemesis represented perhaps the most psychologically complex relationship Rick had developed since losing his original family, combining mutual respect for capabilities with fundamental philosophical disagreements about the appropriate use of power and the moral obligations that accompanied superior intelligence and technological resources. Evil Morty's willingness to assist in hunting Rick Prime was motivated not by sympathy for Rick's losses, but by strategic recognition that eliminating their common enemy would serve his own objectives while also providing him with opportunities to acquire knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything he could develop through independent research and experimentation. The tracking technology that Rick developed using the dimensional residue from Rick Prime's traps represented his most sophisticated application of interdimensional physics since constructing the central finite curve, requiring mathematical frameworks that pushed beyond existing theoretical boundaries, while also demanding engineering precision that exceeded anything he had previously attempted under the pressure of genuine time constraints. The black portal fluid that evil Morty had acquired during his investigations provided crucial components for creating scanning devices capable of detecting Rick Prime's unique quantum signature across dimensional boundaries, but the collaboration required Rick to acknowledge dependence on someone whose capabilities rivaled his own in areas where he had previously claimed absolute superiority. The revelation that Rick Prime had systematically eliminated Diane across infinite realities using the Omega device transformed Rick's understanding of his enemy from dangerous individual who had happened to murder his family into cosmic-scale force of destruction whose activities exceeded even Rick's own campaign of multiversal violence in their scope and psychological sophistication. The evidence that evil Morty presented demonstrated that Rick Prime had not simply killed Rick Cone 37's wife, but had conducted systematic genocide against every version of Diane across accessible dimensions, ensuring that no Rick anywhere could experience the domestic happiness that Rick Prime had chosen to abandon in pursuit of unlimited power and multiversal dominance. Rick's response to learning about the complete elimination of his wife across infinite realities was complicated by his growing recognition that the scope and efficiency of Rick Prime's systematic approach to causing suffering was technically impressive in ways that his own random killing spree had never achieved, revealing how completely his quest for revenge had corrupted his capacity for normal moral reasoning about violence and its appropriate applications. The admiration he felt for Rick Prime's thoroughness was disturbing evidence that decades of casual murder had prepared him to evaluate genocide according to its technical merits, rather than its impact on innocent victims who had committed no crimes except existing in realities that Rick Prime found inconvenient or psychologically threatening. The psychological trap that Rick Prime had constructed for his eventual hunters was elegant in its exploitation of their emotional vulnerabilities and desperate need for reunion with loved ones they had lost to his casual cruelty, demonstrating understanding of Rick's psychology that exceeded what most Ricks possessed about their own motivations and behavioral patterns. The arena where multiple versions of Rick competed for the right to reclaim their murdered wives was designed to force Rick's victims to participate in their own moral degradation by making them complicit in each other's destruction, ensuring that victory would be achieved through betrayal of beings who shared identical trauma and equally justified claims to resurrection and revenge. The other Ricks who had been drawn into Rick Prime's final gambit represented variations on Rick Cone 37's own response to loss and trauma, but their different approaches to grief and revenge revealed the range of possible reactions to the kind of systematic cruelty that Rick Prime specialized in inflicting on versions of himself who had initially chosen love over power. Some had become more violent and ruthless than Rick Cone 37 himself, while others had retained greater connection to ethical frameworks that prevented them from fully embracing the methodical elimination of obstacles that characterized Rick's approach to problem solving through superior firepower and technological dominance. Rick Cone 37's decision to reject the competitive framework and cooperate with evil Morty in escaping Rick Prime's trap represented a rare moment of moral clarity during his long descent toward complete nihilism. But his motivation was primarily strategic rather than ethical, since he recognized that Rick Prime's psychological manipulation was designed to corrupt and eliminate its participants, regardless of which individual Rick managed to survive the competition. The choice to work with evil Morty was based on practical calculation about survival, rather than principled commitment to cooperation or solidarity with other victims of Rick Prime's systematic cruelty. The escape from Rick Prime's arena required Rick to acknowledge his dependence on evil Morty's capabilities in ways that challenged his fundamental assumptions about intellectual superiority and autonomous problem-solving, forcing him to function as junior partner in collaborative relationship with someone whose strategic thinking and technological resources exceeded his own in crucial areas. The solution to their predicament could not be achieved through Rick's individual genius, but demanded coordination and mutual support that treated evil Morty as equal rather than tool to be manipulated according to Rick's preferences and objectives. The final assault on Rick Prime's base dimension revealed the full scope of the industrial complex that Rick Prime had constructed to support his multiversal activities, representing technological achievement that exceeded anything individual Rick should have been capable of accomplishing through independent effort, while also demonstrating complete disregard for sustainability, aesthetics, or the welfare of beings who might be affected by such massive manipulation of dimensional space and energy resources. The scale of Rick Prime's operations suggested that he had developed methods for exploiting entire civilizations as raw materials for projects that served only his personal amusement and psychological requirements. The defense systems that protected Rick Prime's stronghold were designed not merely to eliminate intruders, but to provide their creator with entertainment through systematic torture and humiliation of anyone foolish enough to challenge his security arrangements, demonstrating the same casual sadism that had characterized Rick Prime's approach to eliminating families and individuals who represented obstacles to his objectives or threats to his self-image as supreme intelligence operating beyond conventional moral constraints. The automated weapons and traps revealed Rick Prime's evolution into something that barely retained recognizable connection to normal psychological categories or motivations. The confrontation between Rick Cone 37 and Rick Prime unfolded in an environment that Rick Prime had specifically designed to maximize his psychological advantages while minimizing possibilities that his enemies might achieve quick victory through superior tactics or unexpected technological innovations. Surrounding their battlefield with machinery and infrastructure that emphasized Rick Prime's superior resources and long-term planning capabilities. The industrial settings served as monument to Rick Prime's achievements while highlighting Rick Cone 37's reactive status as someone whose entire existence had been shaped by responses to initiatives rather than autonomous development of original objectives and purposes. Rick Prime's casual revelation that he had murdered Uncle Slow Mobius during their conversation served no strategic purpose, except demonstrating his continuing commitment to psychological warfare and his confidence that Rick Cone 37's emotional responses could be manipulated to create tactical disadvantages during their physical confrontation. The death of someone Rick valued provided additional evidence of Rick Prime's ability to destroy anything that gave Rick's existence meaning or purpose, reinforcing power dynamics that had defined their relationship since Rick Prime's original bombing decades earlier. The psychological warfare that Rick Prime conducted during their fight was more sophisticated and potentially damaging than any physical violence he might have inflicted, targeting Rick's deepest insecurities about his choices and priorities, while highlighting the fundamental futility of revenge as source of meaning or satisfaction that could justify decades of systematic murder and moral compromise. Rick Prime's observations about Rick's transformation from loving father into multiversal predator were devastating precisely because they contained elements of truth that Rick had spent years avoiding through constant action and distraction rather than honest self-examination. Evil Morty's intervention at the crucial moment when Rick Prime seemed likely to achieve final victory over his exhausted and psychologically devastated opponent was accomplished through deception and misdirection that exploited Rick Prime's overconfidence and his tendency to underestimate beings he considered intellectually inferior to himself, demonstrating strategic sophistication that enabled Evil Morty to position himself for acquiring Rick Prime's knowledge and capabilities while allowing Rick Cone 37 to experience the cathartic violence he had sought for decades. The eye patch switch that confused Rick Prime about which Morty he was confronting provided Evil Morty with opportunity to conduct brain extraction procedures, while Rick Prime was distracted by his assumption that normal Morty posed no significant threat to his security. Evil Morty's decision to steal Rick Prime's memories and technological secrets before allowing Rick to complete his revenge was motivated not by altruism or desire to help Rick achieve psychological closure, but by recognition that Rick Prime's accumulated knowledge represented resources that could be used to prevent other Ricks from developing comparable levels of destructive capability and systematic cruelty. The brain extraction was conducted with clinical efficiency that matched Rick Prime's own approach to eliminating obstacles through technological superiority, rather than moral consideration for the welfare of conscious beings whose suffering served no purpose beyond satisfying personal preferences. The moment when Evil Morty revived Rick and left him alone with the incapacitated Rick Prime represented perhaps the most significant gift Rick had ever received, but it was also a form of psychological torture that forced him to confront the reality that his greatest enemy was ultimately just another version of himself who had made different choices about how to respond to trauma, loss, and the discovery of unlimited power across infinite realities. The recognition that Rick Prime was not cosmic force of supernatural evil, but simply another broken person seeking meaning through destruction, made the act of killing him simultaneously more personal and more meaningless than Rick had anticipated. Rick's decision to beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands rather than using weapons or advanced technology was motivated by need for physical and emotional catharsis that decades of planning and preparation could not provide through more efficient methods of execution, allowing Rick to experience every moment of his enemy's suffering, while also forcing him to acknowledge his own transformation into someone capable of taking genuine pleasure in prolonged torture and murder. The violence was intimate and extended, providing opportunity for Rick to process years of accumulated rage, while also demonstrating how completely his quest for revenge had eliminated normal human limitations on cruelty and systematic infliction of pain. Rick Prime's final words during his agonizing death were carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage on his killer by highlighting the existential emptiness that would inevitably follow completion of Rick's life, purpose, and the recognition that his entire identity had been defined by reactions to Rick Prime's actions rather than autonomous development of meaningful goals and relationships. The observation that Rick's existence had been fundamentally shaped by his enemy's initiatives was accurate but also cruel, emphasizing Rick's lack of independent purpose or significance beyond his role as victim and eventual avenger in cosmic drama that had consumed decades without producing genuine satisfaction or healing. The aftermath of Rick Prime's death was characterized not by relief, triumph, or sense of cosmic justice restored, but by profound psychological void that Rick Prime had accurately predicted would follow elimination of the organizing principle that had provided structure and direction to Rick's existence since losing his original family. The completion of his revenge revealed that the meaning and purpose Rick had derived from hunting his enemy were entirely dependent on the continued existence of that enemy, leaving him with no framework for understanding why survival might be worthwhile or what objectives might justify continued engagement with existence. The recognition that evil Morty now possessed Rick Prime's complete knowledge and technological capabilities created new sources of existential anxiety that transcended Rick's normal concerns about personal safety or the welfare of his adopted family, representing potential threat that exceeded anything Rick Prime had posed during his years of casual destruction and systematic elimination of beings who interfered with his objectives. The possibility that someone with intimate understanding of Rick's psychology and unlimited technological resources might decide that multiversal existence would be improved by eliminating all versions of Rick Sanchez created dangers that no amount of individual preparation or defensive planning could adequately address. Evil Morty's final warning about his own capabilities and intentions served both as explanation for his assistance in eliminating Rick Prime and as threat about potential future consequences if Rick attempted to interfere with his broader objectives in dimensions beyond the collapsed central, finite curve, demonstrating that the alliance between them had been temporary convenience rather than foundation for ongoing cooperation or mutual support. The acquisition of Rick Prime's memories and technologies had transformed evil Morty into potentially more dangerous enemy than Rick Prime himself, but his apparent lack of immediate interest in using that power for systematic destruction provided Rick with temporary reprieve from cosmic-scale threats, while offering no guarantees about long-term safety or stability. The irony of Rick's situation following Rick Prime's elimination was not lost on him during moments of quiet reflection about the path that had led from grieving widower to multiversal mass murderer to hollow victor in conflict that had provided no genuine resolution or psychological healing despite consuming his entire adult existence. The revenge he had achieved was complete and brutal, but it had also revealed the fundamental emptiness of his approach to addressing grief and trauma through violence and systematic elimination of obstacles, rather than accepting loss and working toward forms of meaning that did not require enemies to justify continued existence. As Rick faced prospect of continued life without the revenge motivation that had structured his identity for over 30 years, he was forced to confront questions about purpose and meaning that his quest for Rick Prime had enabled him to avoid through constant preparation and systematic violence across infinite realities where his actions had consequences for Rick Prime, countless beings who had never threatened his welfare or interfered with his objectives. The man who had once been motivated by love for his family and later by hatred for their killer now had to discover whether anything remained of his personality that could provide foundation for relationships and activities that transcended his transformation from victim into monster whose achievements were measured primarily in terms of successful eliminations and technological dominance, rather than positive contributions to welfare of conscious beings throughout accessible multiverse. The silence that followed Rick Prime's brutal death was not the peaceful resolution Rick had imagined. During decades of planning and systematic preparation for revenge, but rather the beginning of a psychological crisis that would prove more devastating than any trauma he had previously experienced, as the sudden elimination of his life's organizing principle left him confronting an existential void that made his original grief seem manageable by comparison to the crushing recognition that achieving his ultimate objective had provided no satisfaction, healing, or sense that cosmic justice had been restored through sufficient application of violence and determination across infinite realities that remained fundamentally indifferent to his suffering and accomplishments. The depression that settled over Rick in the aftermath of his successful revenge was qualitatively different from the acute mourning he had experienced immediately after losing Diane and Beth, representing instead the chronic despair of someone who had discovered that 30 years of systematic transformation from loving father into multiversal predator had culminated in hollow victory that revealed the fundamental meaninglessness of his approach to addressing trauma through elimination of external enemies rather than internal healing and acceptance of loss as inevitable aspect of conscious existence in universe that seemed designed to destroy everything individuals valued most deeply. Rick's attempts to resume normal family relationships with Beth, Summer, and especially Morty were handicapped by his growing recognition that the personality traits and emotional responses that had enabled him to function as protective grandfather were inseparable from the same psychological structures that had motivated his campaign of multiversal violence, making authentic connection impossible, while the capacity for casual cruelty and systematic manipulation remained integral aspects of his identity. The love he felt for his adopted family members was genuine, but was contaminated by decades of conditioning that treated other beings as instruments for achieving personal objectives, rather than autonomous individuals deserving of respect and consideration independent of their utility for his psychological stability. The adventures Rick continued to share with Morty during this period were characterized by his increasing emotional detachment from outcomes and consequences that should have demanded his full attention and engagement, as scenarios that had once provided intellectual stimulation and opportunities for demonstrating protective capabilities now felt like meaningless repetitions of patterns that served no purpose beyond occupying time that might otherwise be spent confronting questions about identity and meaning that had no satisfactory answers. The same interdimensional expeditions that had previously created bonds between grandfather and grandson now highlighted Rick's fundamental inability to find meaning in activities that did not involve systematic destruction of obstacles or enemies who could justify continued existence through their opposition. The recognition that his scientific achievements had been motivated primarily by psychological needs rather than genuine desire to understand or improve reality created profound dissonance for someone whose identity had been built around assumptions about intellectual curiosity and objective pursuit of truth through rigorous analysis and experimentation. The technologies Rick had developed, the theoretical frameworks he had constructed, and the problems he had solved all revealed themselves as elaborate rationalizations designed to justify behavior that served his emotional requirements rather than advancing knowledge or benefiting the welfare of conscious beings throughout accessible dimensions. Rick's relationship with alcohol during this period evolved from recreational consumption and social lubricant into systematic self-medication, designed to numb psychological pain and philosophical anxiety that no amount of scientific knowledge or technological capability could address. Through conventional problem-solving approaches, demonstrating his recognition that the analytical methods he had relied upon throughout his adult life were inadequate for processing existential questions that transcended technical challenges or strategic objectives. The drinking was not celebration or social activity, but rather desperate attempt to achieve chemical suppression of consciousness that had become unbearably aware of its own meaninglessness and moral corruption. The family dynamics that Rick had carefully orchestrated through years of manipulation and control began showing signs of structural instability as his reduced engagement with their welfare created opportunities for other family members to develop more autonomous relationships and decision-making processes that did not depend on his constant oversight and technological intervention. The discovery that Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty could function effectively without his protection and guidance was simultaneously reassuring evidence of their resilience and disturbing indication that his role as indispensable patriarch might not be as essential as he had assumed during years of positioning himself as their primary source of security and meaning. Beth's continuing development as independent adult, with her own professional achievements and personal relationships, forced Rick to confront the possibility that his influence on her life had been less beneficial than he had convinced himself, as her growing confidence and emotional stability seemed to correlate with periods when his presence was minimal, rather than times when he had been most actively involved in addressing her problems through technological solutions or strategic manipulation of circumstances. The daughter he had claimed to protect and nurture was thriving despite rather than because of his interventions, suggesting that his protective instincts might have been expressions of his own psychological needs rather than responses to genuine threats or deficiencies in her capabilities. Summer's adolescent development continued along trajectories that reflected her natural intelligence and social skills, rather than dependence on Rick's technological enhancements or interdimensional adventures, demonstrating that the excitement and validation he had provided through exposure to cosmic-scale conflicts and alien civilizations were ultimately less important for her psychological health than stable family relationships and age-appropriate challenges that allowed her to develop confidence through personal achievement, rather than association with Rick's superior capabilities. Her increasing independence from his approval and guidance highlighted how much of their relationship had been based on her temporary need for validation rather than permanent psychological dependency. But it was Rick's evolving relationship with Morty that most clearly revealed the extent to which his approach to family connections had been shaped by his own emotional requirements rather than genuine concern for his grandson's welfare and development. As the boy's moral growth and intellectual maturity began diverging from the patterns Rick had assumed would result from exposure to advanced scientific concepts and interdimensional experiences, Morty's persistent questions about right and wrong reflected ethical frameworks that Rick had been unable to corrupt. Despite years of systematic exposure to situations where survival required violence and deception, suggesting that the boy possessed internal moral resources that were more resilient than Rick had anticipated. The philosophical conversations Rick attempted to conduct with his family members during this period revealed his desperate need for external validation of worldviews and value systems that he could no longer sustain through internal conviction alone, as the intellectual frameworks that had once provided certainty about his choices and priorities now seemed like arbitrary constructions designed to justify behavior that might be indefensible from perspectives that prioritized empathy, cooperation, and concern for collective welfare over individual achievement and technological dominance. The nihilistic conclusions Rick promoted were presented as objective discoveries rather than defensive psychological mechanisms designed to protect him from acknowledging the human cost of his lifestyle and choices. Morty's responses to Rick's attempts at philosophical indoctrination demonstrated the boy's continuing development along moral and intellectual trajectories that offered alternatives to the cycles of violence, manipulation that had characterized Rick's approach to problem-solving throughout his adult existence, providing evidence that exposure to Rick's worldview had not completely eliminated Morty's capacity for ethical reasoning or emotional connection to beings whose welfare transcended immediate family concerns. The possibility that his grandson might avoid the corrupting influences that had shaped Rick's own evolution provided some foundation for hope that transcended his personal despair about meaning and purpose. The most troubling aspect of Rick's psychological state during this period was his growing inability to distinguish between genuine care for his family's welfare and strategic maintenance of relationships that served his own need for meaning and connection in existence that had been revealed as fundamentally empty of intrinsic purpose or significance. The emotional investment he felt in Morty's development was authentic, but was also instrumentalized in ways that treated the boy as therapeutic resource rather than autonomous individual, deserving of protection and guidance based on his own needs and interests rather than Rick's. Psychological requirements for validation and companionship. The recognition that many of his influences on Morty's development had been negative or morally ambiguous in ways that might have long-term consequences. Rick could neither predict nor control created additional sources of anxiety about his legacy and the possibility that his attempts to provide protection and education had actually increased rather than reduced the dangers his grandson would face throughout his life. The adventures they had shared, the technologies Rick had exposed him to, and the philosophical frameworks he had promoted all carried risks that might manifest in ways that would make Morty's future more difficult rather than expanding his opportunities for happiness and fulfillment. Rick's interactions with other versions of himself during occasional visits to surviving Rick communities revealed the extent to which his successful completion of revenge had isolated him from potential sources of understanding and support among beings who shared his basic psychology and capabilities but remained motivated by ongoing projects that provided structure and direction for their continued existence. The Ricks, who were still pursuing their own quests for meaning and achievement, could not relate to someone who had accomplished his primary objective only to discover its ultimate futility, while those who had found alternative sources of purpose seemed to inhabit entirely different categories of psychological reality. The technological projects Rick pursued during this period became increasingly abstract and disconnected from practical applications that might benefit his family or contribute to broader social welfare, representing intellectual exercises designed to occupy his mind with sufficiently complex challenges to prevent sustained reflection on existential questions that had no solutions accessible through conventional analytical approaches. The same curiosity that had once been directed toward problems with clear humanitarian benefits was now channeled into investigations that served no function except temporary distraction from awareness of his own meaninglessness and moral corruption. The casual way that Rick had learned to treat interdimensional travel and reality manipulation as routine aspects of daily life had eliminated his capacity to experience wonder or excitement about discoveries and capabilities that should have provided profound satisfaction and intellectual fulfillment, demonstrating how systematic exposure to unlimited possibility had paradoxically reduced rather than expanded his appreciation for the remarkable nature of existence and consciousness. The technologies that enabled him to reshape reality according to his preferences had become mundane tools rather than miraculous achievements worthy of contemplation and gratitude. Rick's growing awareness of his own mortality during this period was accompanied not by philosophical acceptance or spiritual preparation, but by increasing anxiety about the meaninglessness of his legacy and the recognition that his death would eliminate whatever small positive influence he might still be capable of exerting on people he cared about, despite his fundamental inability to engage authentically with their emotional needs and developmental requirements. The prospect of non-existence was disturbing not because it represented cessation of consciousness, but because it highlighted how little of lasting value his extraordinary life had actually produced for anyone, including himself. The family's gradual adjustment to Rick's reduced role in their daily decision-making processes and crisis management revealed their underlying strength and adaptability, while also forcing Rick to acknowledge that his protective functions might have been less essential than he had assumed during years of positioning himself as indispensable guardian, whose technological capabilities were necessary for their survival and prosperity. The realization that they could thrive without constant access to his advanced knowledge and interdimensional resources was simultaneously reassuring and profoundly unsettling for someone whose sense of purpose had become dependent on being needed by people whose welfare he valued above his own. Psychological comfort. The most tragic aspect of Rick's post-revenge existence was his recognition that the relationships he had built through deception and manipulation represented his most significant achievements in terms of creating meaning and emotional connection, despite their foundation in systematic dishonesty about his origins, motivations, and the true nature of his psychological needs and capabilities. The love he felt for Beth, Summer, and Morty was genuine emotional investment rather than simply strategic performance, but it coexisted with his fundamental inability to engage honestly about the deception that had made their relationships possible in the first place. The possibility that complete honesty about his identity and history might destroy the family bonds that provided his only remaining source of meaning created psychological paralysis that prevented Rick from addressing the fundamental contradictions underlying his domestic existence, trapping him in patterns of behavior that required continued performance of identity that no longer felt authentic, while also preventing development of relationships based on mutual understanding and acceptance rather than carefully maintained ignorance about crucial aspects of his personality and past experiences. The man who had spent decades eliminating obstacles through superior intelligence and technological dominance found himself unable to solve problems that required emotional vulnerability and moral courage rather than analytical capability. As Rick struggled to find new sources of purpose and direction in existence that no longer revolved around clear enemies or definable objectives, he was forced to confront fundamental questions about what made life worth living. That his extraordinary capabilities and cosmic perspective had not prepared him to answer successfully through conventional application of scientific method or technological innovation. The same intelligence that enabled him to manipulate dimensional boundaries and reshape reality according to his preferences remained helpless when applied to psychological and philosophical challenges that could not be resolved through superior analysis or strategic elimination of obstacles and opposition. The stage was set for Rick's most difficult test, determining whether someone who had spent 30 years transforming himself into cosmic force of destruction could discover forms of meaning that did not require enemies to defeat or problems to solve through violence and systematic loss, manipulation of other conscious beings, whether the capacity for love and authentic connection that had motivated his original refusal of Rick Prime's offer could be recovered from beneath accumulated psychological damage of decades spent as multiversal predator whose protection of loved ones required systematic oppression of countless others, whose welfare he had learned to consider irrelevant to his personal objectives and emotional requirements for stability and purpose in universe that seemed designed to reward cruelty while punishing compassion and hope for genuine human connection, transcending power dynamics and technological superiority. And so we conclude our journey through the infinite tragedy of Rick Sanchez, a man whose brilliant mind became both his greatest gift and his ultimate curse. From humble inventor to multiversal god, from loving father to revenge-obsessed killer, Rick's story reveals the terrible price of intelligence without wisdom, power without purpose, and infinite possibilities without meaningful connections to anchor consciousness in something larger than individual desire and pain. Perhaps Rick's true tragedy lies not in the loss of his original family, devastating though that was, but in his inability to find peace in the family that chose to love him, despite witnessing his capacity for casual cruelty and systematic manipulation. The relationships he built through deception provided genuine moments of connection and purpose, yet remained forever contaminated by the fundamental dishonesty that made them possible, trapping him between authentic emotion and performed identity in ways that prevented the healing he desperately needed. As you drift toward peaceful sleep tonight, consider that even in infinite realities, even with unlimited power, the simple human connections we forge each day remain the only things that truly matter in existence, that might otherwise seem random and meaningless. Rick learned too late that replacing people is possible through technological mastery, but replacing love never works because authentic relationships cannot be manufactured or optimized through superior intelligence and strategic manipulation. Rest now in this singular, irreplaceable dimension we call home, where every choice carries weight, every relationship has meaning, and every moment of peace is precious, precisely because it cannot be infinitely replicated across dimensional boundaries that eliminate consequence and genuine significance from conscious experience.